Chapter 724. At night, the aroma of barbecue wafted out from a barbecue buffet area at the back of the hotel, filling the cool sea breeze with the smell of barbecue. Jinwan turned to look at the faint smell from a distance. She saw the red bits of meat scattered on the ground in the distance, creating a lively and beautiful scene after the barbecue. Jinwan stood up and moved closer. There was a family of foreigners, about a dozen of them, who had come to the island for a holiday. They had specially booked the only area in the hotel that allowed barbecue. When they saw Jinwan, they were very hospitable. She thought she was just a traveler staying in the hotel, but when the waiter by the side reminded her that she was the wife of the owner of this island, they were even more surprised and invited Jinwan to eat with them. The family was very hospitable. Jinwan's English was very fluent, and it did not affect her communication with so many people. In the end, as they ate and chatted, she got high and couldn't help but drink 2 cans of beer. After all, this was the last night on the island and the first stop of their holiday. Jinwan was in a very good mood, and as soon as she was in a good mood, she couldn't hold back her bottom line. Naturally, he forgot the promise he made 3 years ago that he would not drink less, and even not drink with unfamiliar people. The side of the pool downstairs was empty except for the iPad placed on the recliner. Jinwan's figure was nowhere to be seen. Mo Jingshan picked up the iPad on the recliner and heard the sound of people eating and drinking and the smell of barbecue nearby. He guessed that Jinwan had not eaten barbecue for a long time and was probably attracted by the smell. As expected, when the waiter outside saw him come down to look for Jinwan, he came over and said that she had gone to the barbecue area. By the time he arrived, Jinwan had already gulped down 2 cans of beer and was chatting happily with a bearded man in his 30s. It was unknown what they were talking about, but the bearded man laughed heartily and handed a can of beer to Jinwan. Jinwan did not reject him and opened the can with a ka sound. She was about to drink when she suddenly sensed someone's gaze. She paused and turned to glance at the entrance of the barbecue area. The moment she saw the man standing under the cold moonlight and watching her indifferently as she prepared to drink, Jinwan's movements stiffened. She had been a little high earlier, but now she was abruptly sober. Right now she was a recovering patient. She either pretended to be weak or said that it hurt here and there. In any case, she bullied him endlessly and then found an excuse to show weakness so that he wouldn't fight back. Now she even dared to drink alcohol? Ahem, I have something to do. I'll go. Thank you. Jinwan greeted the family with a smile and nodded politely to them. At the same time, she told the waiter to bring them more seafood, meat, beer and other things. The barbecue would be put under her and Mo Jingshan's names, so they didn't have to pay. She then stood up and walked over. When she approached Mo Jingshan, she heard the man's mild voice. You came here to eat barbecue and drink beer while I wasn't paying attention? Jinwan. I smelled it and came over. I couldn't help myself. Mo Jingshan glanced at him again. Didn't you say your stomach hurt in the afternoon? It doesn't hurt anymore? For the past few days, every time this man pressed her down on the sofa and kissed her, she would take the opportunity to pretend to be sick. At this moment, she unnaturally raised her hand and scratched her ear. And, it doesn't hurt anymore. Well, it's good that it doesn't hurt. The man glanced at her again, took her hand and turned to leave. Seeing that he didn't seem to have any intention of pursuing the matter, Jinwan was slightly relieved and obediently followed him back. Fortunately, she had eaten quite a few skewers of barbecued meat just now, otherwise she would probably be very hungry now. Just as they were about to return to the room, the man held her hand in the elevator with one hand and put the other in his trouser pocket. He glanced sideways at her. Did I starve you? No. If you weren't hungry, why would you freeload off others? Isn't he barbecuing? If you want to eat barbecued meat, you can tell me. Is there anything I can't satisfy you? You just had gastritis a few days ago. Let's just eat something normal or light. You can't eat barbecued meat or anything like that. I only went to chat with him and ate a few skewers. Mo Jingshan glanced at her again. Seeing that Jinwan's gaze was very sincere, he did not say anything more and brought the little woman back to the room. Originally, Jinwan thought that this matter was just a small interlude. However, when Mo Jingshan went to prepare dinner, she had just finished showering when she smelled the scent of barbecued meat. She walked out while drying her hair. When she entered the kitchen, she saw that on the stove in front of Boss Missouri, there was a small barbecue equipment that the hotel staff had brought in. There were various meat skewers, shrimp skewers, vegetable skewers, chicken skewers, and other essential ingredients for barbecuing. The smell was even more fragrant than the skewers she had earlier. Jinwan's hand, which was holding the towel, froze on top of her head. She stared dumbfoundedly at the back view of the man dressed in a white shirt who was grilling skewers for her in the kitchen. However, the fragrance of vegetable porridge wafted out from the rice cooker by the side. This meant that he still planned on sticking to a light diet for a few more days. However, in order to not treat her unfairly, he specially barbecued meat for her and let her eat her fill. It would be a lie to say that she was not touched. Jinwan walked in. She looked at the skewers of fresh meat and various ingredients before turning back to look at the man. I can't eat so much by myself. The man did not turn back. He was currently sprinkling seasoning on the skewers. He calmly said, eat as much as you can. Eat until you're full. Otherwise you'll have to freeload off others. Jinwan was embarrassed. She was only freeloading off a meal. How did she offend him? It's fine if you're just freeloading off. Just a few skewers of meat is enough to make you lower your guard. You even dare to accept alcohol from anyone. Jinwan. Only then did she realize that earlier when he went to look for her, she seemed to be chatting with that family's 30-year-old son. She was talking about what he had seen and heard as well as some of his experiences studying in China. That was why Jinwan was chatting and laughing with him for so long. It seemed like Boss Missouri had misunderstood. Jinwan held back her laughter and did not explain. She stood by his side and stared at the vegetable skewers that were already done. She anxiously asked, "Can I have a taste first?" The man glanced at her and did not reply. Chapter 725. Seeing the little woman's greedy appearance, Mo Jingshan said, "You're really useless." However, he still casually picked up a skewer of vegetables that was no longer hot and fed it to her. Jinwan smacked her lips in satisfaction, saying that it was delicious. She then contentedly turned to change her clothes, preparing to eat the rest of the food that Boss Missouri had personally roasted. The result of eating too much at night was that she could not sleep no matter what. Although the 2 cans of beer that Jinwan drank did not make her drunk, it made her more energetic. After eating the barbecue, she took a shower to prevent the smell of barbecue from covering her body. She then paced back and forth in the room for half a day, digesting the food for a while before sitting down. Because she had eaten too much earlier, it was mainly because Boss Mo's barbecue skills were exceptionally good, especially the seasonings that he had prepared. If they were sold as barbecue seasonings, many barbecue shops would most likely pay a high price for them. After all, they were truly delicious. After much difficulty, she could finally lie down. Jinwan tossed and turned on the bed, unable to fall asleep. She was most likely thinking about her journey and plans after returning to America. She was slightly excited, but also slightly reluctant to part with the slow life on this island. Mo Jingshan had been by her side the entire time. However, as she lay down, he sat against the headboard. In his hands were several documents that he had just printed out. In order to accompany her to sleep, he had specially printed out the electronic versions. It was convenient for him to accompany her while not affecting his work. Still not sleeping? Hearing the little woman turn over again, Mo Jingshan glanced at her. It was indeed time to sleep, but she just could not. Jinwan placed her head in his embrace. "I can't sleep. Do you have anything you want to say? Or is there something on your mind?" Mo Jingshan held her hand, placing it on his body. He half sat up, allowing her to use his body as a pillow. The belt of his nightgown was not tied very tightly. Following his collarbone, she could faintly see the perfect lines of the man's chest and abdomen through the gap. "I'm thinking if we stay outside for too long, will it be bad? Get to the point." His hands formed a subtle arc by her side, cleverly encircling her in an embrace. His dark eyes fell into her eyes, but it seemed like he was abstinent. He didn't want to do anything, but he domineeringly wrapped her in his scent. "I think it's better to shorten the trip. Wouldn't it be too heartless of me to leave the company to Xiatian and pretend to be sick? You have a conscience with everyone else, but you like to play the role of an ingrate in front of me." Mo Jingshan's hand brushed against her cheek. His tone seemed to be smiling, but it also seemed to be gritting his teeth. "I'm being serious. I've already taken you away from Shine Group and occupied you for several months. Wouldn't it be too much to continue to occupy you?" "Yes." Mo Jingshan unhurriedly grabbed the belt of her nightgown that was gradually loosening. "Are you done? Can I sleep now? Then shouldn't we go back earlier?" The man did not answer and instead said, "I don't think your condition is as serious as you say. You even dare to drink, what else can't you do?" "That's not what I'm talking about right now." Before she could finish speaking, she realized something was wrong. The pitiful belt around the waist of her nightgown was nowhere to be seen. His fingers had already reached under her open collar. His palms seemed to know her body like the back of his hand. It seemed like he was carelessly moving around, but it caused her to tremble slightly. Jinwan instantly entered a guarded state, alarm bells ringing loudly. Didn't you say you want to sleep? She did not have time to struggle and was already pressed under his arms. I don't see that you're sleepy. This is because you need to vent the alcohol. Why don't I accompany you to vent it? Even at this time he did not forget to show off his black-bellied nature. It was clearly what he wanted to do, but he still blamed it on her drinking. To deal with a little heartless person like you as expected, I can't be too soft-hearted. Why don't I make breakfast for you tomorrow morning? Let Boss Missouri have a good sleep? I definitely won't make you wake up early to make breakfast for me again. The arrow was already on the bowstring, but the prey still wanted to struggle on its deathbed. I can't wait. The tip of his tongue circled down her neck, leaving behind a decadent red mark. She instantly released an uncontrollable whimper. Amidst the broken words, it was already impossible to distinguish his name. His voice reverberated by her ears. Sometimes, it was as though he was far away, and sometimes, it was as though he was close by with warmth. She closed her eyes as though she had fallen into the deep and boundless ocean in his eyes. Old rules pay with your body. The man's voice was so heavy that it could easily capture her soul. Usually, when Mo Jingshan wanted to let her go out of consideration for her, even when she could no longer endure it, he would have an astonishingly strong self-control. Even if he had to take a cold shower for an hour, he would definitely not make things difficult for her. However, when this man did not intend to let her go, she would always be helpless against his ferocious plundering. Earlier, when he called her a little white-eyed wolf, she felt that she was slightly better than him. However, in the face of his sudden kiss, it was instantly crushed. It turned into dust and flowed away, melting into his bottomless abyss. The man easily pried open her teeth. It appeared as though he was attacking fiercely, forcing her to retreat. Even her breathing became erratic. However, his hands were extremely patient, as though he was afraid of scaring her. She could only grip his sleeves tightly, struggling to not let herself fall. After a long time, the man finally let go of her, as though giving her a chance to breathe. However, in a moment of carelessness, the man's hand had already reached for her waist. His hot palm seemed to carry a low fever, burning her lumbar spine and making it numb. When his slender, well-jointed fingers slid across her skin, there was a different kind of pleasure. His fingertips were like a swimming fish going anywhere. In the past, every time she resisted and resisted, it was because of the knots in her heart that should not have existed. Now, she could only say that she was almost frightened by her own passion. She did not dare to face herself who actually missed him so much. But Gu Yuang had already bloomed into a gorgeous flower. She couldn't hide it even if she wanted to. She swayed her vines and bound her heart towards him. Jinwan's iPad was thrown on the bedside. At this time, the screen suddenly lit up, and the news of Shine Group's new cooperation project popped up. Although Mo Jingshan did not personally go back to participate as the CEO, he would definitely put his photo on the news. In the photo he was still immaculately dressed. The collar of his shirt and suit were tightly fitted. From the corner of her eye, Jinwan caught a glimpse of the photo of the news that had lit up on the screen. She immediately had an evil thought. She looked at the man who was currently doing things to her body and bit down on his Adam's apple that was rolling up and down. Chapter 726. However, the result of this bite was that Mo Jingshan reached out to hold the back of her neck, lowering his head to kiss her harshly. Due to her provocation, his kiss became more and more forceful and domineering. It was so passionate that it was almost rough. His fingers slid down bit by bit, pushing aside the hem of her dress and rubbing against her thighs. The numbness began to spread from his fingertips, and soon she was completely limp. Her body rose into the air, and she subconsciously hooked her legs around his waist. Mo Jingshan, what are you doing? However, in the next moment her entire body was carried onto his body. It was clear that she was on top, he chuckled softly. Because she hadn't completely sat down and was still half in his arms, the man's breath entered her ears, knocking against her eardrums and invading her brain. It intertwined with the desire in her mind that even she couldn't suppress, flashing like sparks of fire in a haze. Don't you dislike being bullied by me? I'll give you a chance to be a queen. Jinwan. The next morning when Jinwan woke up with a sore back, Mo Jingshan was already dressed neatly and reading the morning newspaper delivered by the hotel in the living room. She walked out in her slippers, yawning as she glared at the well-dressed man who acted as if nothing had happened. Beast. Dressed like a beast. Mo Jingshan seemed to have heard her silent criticism. He lowered the morning paper and looked at her with his dark eyes. Both of them had gone to bed very late, and Jinwan was sleepy even though she had slept for at least an hour longer than him, but the man's eyes didn't show the slightest tiredness. Breakfast is on the table. Eat quickly. We're going to the airport today. Got it? Knowing that they had to catch a flight today, he refused to let her off last night. It was not enough to end it once. He insisted on making her faint several times before he stopped. She opened the plate on the table. Inside were the crab dumplings that the hotel had specially made for them. Mo Jingshan needed to nourish his stomach for the next few days, but Jinwan didn't need to. She thought she was already satisfied with the barbecue he made for her last night. She didn't expect that she would have such authentic crab roe soup dumplings to eat before she left today. However, the process of making this thing was so troublesome. He must have informed the hotel and asked them to deliver it early in the morning. Jinwan had been tormented by the man for an entire night. In the second half of the night, she felt that the barbecue she had eaten had been completely digested. She had been hungry for a long time. Right now she couldn't care less and directly sat down to eat. Didn't you say yesterday that the hotel is near the sea and the morning air is very cold? Can't you put on your clothes? Mo Jingshan looked at the nightgown hanging from her shoulders and could not help but sigh. He reached out to help her adjust her collar. It wouldn't have mattered if she hadn't pulled it, but with this gentle tug, a ray of spring light was pulled away from her collar. Between her snow-white neck and collarbone, light red spots were scattered all over the places he kissed last night. The marks that could not be hidden were written into her body, honestly recording all the joy of love last night. What are you trying to do now? It's so early in the morning and I'm still being raped by you while eating. Mo Jingshan, you cultured scum. Jinwan's body instinctively went on alert. She, who was still chewing on the soup bun, slapped away his hand that was protecting her collar. You definitely can't continue. We'll be late for the plane. What are you thinking about? Mo Jingshan's handsome brows moved slightly. In the end, he only smiled and picked up the coat hanging on the back of the chair to cover her shoulders. Hurry up and eat. We have to catch the plane. Oh. The alarm was lifted. She could eat in peace. Also. He thought for a moment before turning back. Recently, the weather in Los Angeles has been very cold. Don't wear too little, especially clothes that reveal your shoulders. Recently, he had watched Jinwan swim more often. Mo Jingshan increasingly felt that he wanted to hide every part of this little woman's body. Even if it was just an ordinary spaghetti strap dress, he could not let her wear it. After all, it was really too easy to attract a man's attention. Jinwan continued to eat. When he was not paying attention, she softly muttered, "Miser." The last minute of Jinwan's life on the Argentinian island was stretched by Mo Jingshan to the point that it felt like a century. They passed by the dessert shop in the departure hall. Jinwan wanted to eat sundaes and ice cream, but Mo Jingshan refused to let her eat anything cold. Instead, he bought ice cream-flavored donuts for her. They passed by the various unremarkable specialty shops in the departure hall, which also had a variety of exotic styles. In the end, when they were finally about to board the plane, they did not take the first-class entrance but stood at the back of the crowd. Rather than saying that Mo Jingshan was completely complying with Jinwan's wishes, it was more accurate to say that Jinwan wanted Boss Missouri to interact with the common people. After all, it seemed that every time she returned to Los Angeles something big happened, but after all, Shine Group was here and so was the Mo family of Los Angeles. This was also the place where she studied when she was a teenager, so even though Jinwan had almost been traumatized by Los Angeles, this place was still indissoluble in her life. She still had to travel around High City in Los Angeles. She didn't know that Mo Jingshan had relinquished his power in the underground arms trade and was no longer in charge of it. She just thought that Atuda and the other troublesome people had been completely dealt with, and that was why he returned to Los Angeles so peacefully and no longer had any trouble. As soon as they returned, Mo Jingshan's mother, Ms. Wanzhou, got the news that Jinwan and the others had returned to Los Angeles. Although Mo Xiaoza and Ms. Wanzhou were old and no longer in charge of the company's affairs, they had worked hard for Shine for many years, so they must still be in close contact with the company. The person in charge of this matter must have told them that Mo Jingshan had gone to Argentina and that Jinwan and Mo Jingshan were together. So less than 2 days after returning to Los Angeles, Ms. Wanzhou came to ask Jinwan to go back to live with the Mo family in Los Angeles. She still called Jinwan daughter-in-law. Even though they hadn't seen each other for 3 years, she was still familiar with them. On the contrary, Mo Jingshan had no intention of letting Jinwan go back with him, nor did he intend to let Jinwan leave his sight. When returning to Los Angeles, he had to go back to Shine's headquarters to deal with some important affairs, so Jinwan simply stayed in the break room in his office. Chapter 727. Qin Siding happened to return to the United States these days and was caught by Mo Jingshan to examine Jinwan. From the beginning he knew that Jinwan's head injury wouldn't be a big problem after Dr. Wendell's operation, and the remaining blood would be completely absorbed by the brain. But Jinwan's recovery speed was indeed very fast. When he came to check on her, Qin Siding couldn't help saying, "Sure enough, he didn't take a vacation to look after you at home for nothing." This kind of inseparable way not only greatly stimulates your dependence and familiarity with him, but also allows you to stay in a safe environment. Such a peaceful way of recovery is good for you. At least this headache will be mostly relieved. Will you still have headaches in the future? Jinwan asked. At present, after all, it hasn't been long since I recovered. In the short term, I may have headaches due to strenuous exercise, or symptoms such as car sickness and plain sickness. I may not be able to bear the pressure of high altitude and some ordinary bumps. Usually, I won't have any headaches, but after a certain period of treatment, I will slowly recover. Don't worry. Qin Siding's words were always reliable. Jinwan didn't need to worry, and now she didn't need to. Since Ms. Wanzhou learned that Jinwan and Mo Jingshan had returned to Los Angeles, even if she couldn't bring her daughter-in-law home as she wished, she still came to the company to talk to Jinwan every day. Jinwan was still hiding from the people of MN Group, especially from Xia Tian. She still pretended that she had not recovered from her illness and tried to stall for as long as she could. So when there was no company business coming to her, she was really bored. Being dragged around by Wanzhou to go shopping and chat with her was a good way to save her boredom. When passing by a photography studio opened by a Chinese in Los Angeles, Wanzhou suddenly tugged at Jinwan's cuff with bright eyes. "Daughter-in-law, when you and Jingshan got married, didn't you take wedding photos?" Jinwan also looked in the direction of the photography studio. They did take wedding photos, but they also didn't take them. At that time, she didn't know much about the man she was going to marry. It was only because of Ji Hongwen's persuasion and for grandfather Mo's sake that she agreed to let the photographer take a few photos of her at home with the wedding dress he had chosen for her. Although there were wedding photos of her and Mo Jingshan, they were all single photos. The only one that was in the same frame was photoshopped. After all, she did not remember seeing Mo Jingshan before the wedding. After that, those photos were never displayed in the U Garden. After all, she was unwilling to display them in the beginning. Later, because they were all taken alone, she felt that it was meaningless, so she never took them out again. So when Wanzhou took her into the studio and offered to book a set of wedding photos for the two of them, Jinwan did not refuse. In fact, she was also very curious about the process of taking wedding photos. Furthermore, she had never taken this kind of photo with Mo Jingshan in her previous lives, so she more or less had a little desire. Although Mo Jingshan had been busy these days in Los Angeles, he only took a look at Jinwan when Wanzhou arranged for him and Jinwan to take wedding photos. Seeing that Jinwan seemed to be looking forward to it, he didn't refuse. After asking about the scheduled time, he told his secretary to clear the photo shoot time and not to arrange other work, which obviously meant that he agreed to accompany Jinwan to take the photo. In fact, the wedding photo shoot was scheduled for 2 days later. That day, Mo Jingshan drove Jinwan there in person, without needing Ms. Wanzhou's nagging to remind him. After all, his wife was his. As long as Jinwan cared about him, as long as she wanted, he would spend 10 times more energy and time to accompany her to make up for all the regrets he had. At least, he couldn't leave any regrets in case this little woman always found reasons to be unreasonable with him. This studio was specially chosen by Ms. Wanzhou. It was said that an old friend's great-grandfather had studied abroad more than 100 years ago and then settled in the United States, where he opened a studio here. This studio had been open for more than 100 years and was now a very famous studio in Los Angeles. Most of the people who came here to take photos were Chinese. Of course, some foreigners who wanted to take photos in Chinese classical style would also come here. Recently, Wanzhou also wanted to take good care of the two of them, so when she booked the photo shoot, she took the initiative to choose 4 sets of clothes for them in advance. Jinwan trusted Ms. Wanzhou very much, so she naturally wore whatever she had. The first 2 sets of her white wedding dress and Mo Jingshan's suit were very normal, and the photos were also very happy. The third set was purely in Chinese classical style, the kind of bright red wedding dress, and also very beautiful. Based on Madame Wanzhou's age, no matter how fashionable she was, the things that caught her eye would definitely follow the rules. She would not come up with all sorts of novel ideas like young people. However, she had to admit that although these styles were conventional, each one was more festive than the last. It made Jinwan feel as though she was not married to Mo Jingshan for long. Instead, it was as though she was preparing for her wedding. There were several times when she changed her clothes and came out to take photos. Under the thin layer of foundation in her bridal dress, her face would turn red. And the fourth set. Before entering the fitting room, Jin Wan's mind had been set on the clothing of women of the Republic of China in the anti-Japanese war films, or those young ladies from wealthy families, or those singing at night in Shanghai. She tried on several sets of cheongsam in a row. Although they were beautiful, Jin Wan could not show much style. Especially with Ms. Wanzhou watching from the side with a smile, she was even more stiff. In the end, she either dressed up as a young lady in a standard photo studio style, or dressed up as a prostitute with the taste of a good woman. Facing the mirror, she twisted her body with her hands on her hips, stretched out her slender legs, and tried to throw a kiss and a wink. It was not that Jin Wan did not know how to dress seductively. It was not that she had never been sexy before, but Ms. Wanzhou was by the side. She wanted to act very flirtatious, but she still held back a little. Her movements were also slightly stiff, so for some reason she looked very much like a child secretly wearing an adult's clothes. In the end, Ms. Wanzhou thought that she was tired from taking photos today and did not want her to be too tired, so she simply gave up on this classic and sexy look and decided on a scholarly student's outfit. In the end, very good. After putting it on, Jin Wan felt that she could directly participate in the Yellow River cantata. Jin Wan looked at herself in the mirror with two braids and felt a little discouraged. She wondered if she had really become too thin recently. She could even wear sexy clothes to look like a good woman. In the end, she could only dress up like this. No wonder Mo Jingshan said she was thin every day and told her to eat more every meal. Jin Wan's eyes lit up. Chapter 728. Jin Wan looked at herself in the mirror. She was dressed like a student of the Republic of China. Although she was beautiful and Mrs. Wanzhou praised her by the side, Jin Wan still complained that she was too thin. She touched her waist and made a plan in her heart. From tonight onwards she would have at least 2 dinners, a plate of vegetables and a plate of meat. She thought as she walked out of the changing room, wanting to call the makeup artist over. Not far behind the changing room was a small balcony. Occasionally there would be staff smoking there. Jin Wan knew that Mo Jingshan's changing room was not far from there and subconsciously glanced in that direction. In the end, she saw that the small balcony was covered with a warm sunlight weave, and there was a tall and straight figure standing against the direction of the light, which made her feel a little strange but also so familiar. His shoulders were draped in a thick, dark trench coat. Around his collar was a circle of fur that indicated his status. Under the sunlight, it shone with the unique luster of animal fur. Above his black hair was a wide-brimmed hat of the same color. A long, light-colored scarf hung from his neck all the way to his waist, swaying gently with his movements. She saw him turn his body slightly. The dark gray 3-piece suit accentuated his waist into a charming curve, and the elegant bronze-colored metal buckle became a low-key decoration. Under the love of the light, the retro patterns on it could be seen clearly. He tightened his black leather gloves. The lighter in his hand, which was originally meant for decoration but could also be used, made a crisp sound. Then he lowered his head slightly and lit a white cigarette. Jin Wan rarely saw Mo Jingshan smoke. She only remembered that when she first returned from London and saw him in High City, he seemed to smoke a lot at that time. However, it gradually decreased. She had also heard from Shin Mu that Mo Jingshan did not like to smoke. Even if he did, it was only occasionally. However, in the 3 years she was not around, he was indeed a heavy smoker. That lighter was clearly just a prop for taking pictures. The cigarette must have been a staff member who saw him dressed like this and felt that he should be handed one to Mo Jingshan. Thus, Mo Jingshan took it and because he was waiting for her to change, lit it up. At this moment she saw Mo Jingshan. His side profile with the cigarette in his mouth. When he lowered his head, his Adam's apple moved slightly. Between the cuffs of his white shirt and his black gloves, his wrist that was not wrapped in any cloth. The collar he clasped tightly, and the finger that gently loosened his tie. It was as though they had turned into walking hormones, ruthlessly firing several shots in her heart, killing her on the spot. Jin Wan was so absorbed in watching that she accidentally bumped into the cleaning tools by the door of the changing room and fell to the ground with a clang, shattering all the fantasies she had about pouncing on Big Boss. Mo Jingshan seemed to have heard the noise. He extinguished the remaining half of the cigarette and narrowed his eyes to look at her. When he turned around, his trench coat and scarf formed a perfect arc, and the lines of tension were thrown into her heart. She only saw his eyes under the brim of his hat and black hair. They were very deep and because of this rare outfit they looked very unruly. It was as though he had turned into the Republic of Mo Jingshan. And the Mo of her. Mo Jingshan of Mo of Jingshan Mo. He had easily snatched away her 3 spiritual and 7 physical souls. Yet, when the man looked at her, he walked over after a while. Mo Jingshan sized her up. It was clear that he was suspicious of the style of Jinwan's clothes. Are you going to go on a cruise? Jinwan touched her Republic of China student attire and her 2 braids. She could not help but say with a sullen expression, recently, no matter how much I eat, I can't gain any weight. I've been too skinny for the past few months. I should be dressed like a singer. It's perfect for a business tycoon like you, but right now, I can't support that kind of clothes. Mo Jingshan held back his laughter. He looked at Jinwan, who had turned into a literary young man because she could not dress like a singer. He then glanced at the light blue student attire and long skirt she was wearing. This is not bad. Who told you that a business tycoon must like a singer? My stomach has just recovered. It's not good to eat too much fish and meat. Plain porridge and side dishes suit my appetite. Plain porridge and side dishes? Have you forgotten how sexy I was when I first came back from London and was pursued by all kinds of men? She was still a little thin since she was injured and in a coma. When her figure returned to its perfect state, let's see if he still dared to say she was a plain porridge and side dishes. Jinwan was not willing to be a plain porridge and side dish. She turned back to the dressing room and planned to change into a cheongsam. Mo Jingshan waited at the door for a moment. Because Jinwan said she wanted to choose her own clothes, he asked the staff to go out first. Wanju also came out to find the water dispenser to pour a glass of water for Jinwan. Only Jinwan was left in the room. The man glanced at the dressing room, which was slightly closed by Ms. Wanju. He frowned and reached out to help close the door so as not to expose himself. However, the moment he approached the door, he caught a glimpse of the scene inside. He kept his hand on the door handle and did not move. His little woman. She reluctantly changed into the faraway songstress clothes. From the beginning, her body was exposed and then she put on the clothes. Then she stood in front of the mirror and kept posing. She threw coquettish glances and pouted to show all kinds of sexy and charming expressions. Perhaps she felt that it was not enough, so she pulled down the clothes on her shoulders and continued to pose with her thighs exposed in front of the mirror. Perhaps the 2 braids on her head were too strange, so she untied her hair and stood in front of the mirror with her long hair hanging loose. So how satisfied was she with the clothes he was wearing that she was so dissatisfied with herself because of the contrast? The little woman pinched the cloth on her waist from time to time, wondering if she should use a clip to clamp a piece of cloth behind her so that she would not look too thin. After posing like this for a long time, Jinwan was tired of blinking and finally glanced at the door out of the corner of her eye. However, she suddenly saw the man outside the door who had been watching her for a long time. She screamed and turned to rush over to close the door, but she ran too fast. She was wearing indoor slippers for changing clothes, so she staggered and fell forward. The man outside the door opened the door unsurprisingly and caught the little woman who threw herself into his arms. When Jinwan stumbled out of his arms, looking at her disheveled hair, Mo Jingshan smiled slightly. The way you threw yourself into my arms is more seductive than any other style. Chapter 729. When it was finally time to take a photo, Jinwan still wore her outfits and stood together with Mo Jingshan. In the end, the experienced photography teacher smacked his lips and was especially satisfied. His mouth was full of praises of a perfect match. His steady tone added the color of age to this studio that had been open for more than 100 years in Los Angeles. Mrs. Wanju was all smiles by the side. When the photo shoot was over, she rushed over to hold Jinwan's hand and asked her if she was tired, as though she was afraid of exhausting her daughter-in-law. Perhaps it was because Mrs. Wanju had been too excited for the past 2 days that she couldn't keep her mouth shut, or perhaps it was because she had received Mo Jingshan's tacit approval that she told Elder Mo about their wedding photo shoot. Thus, Elder Mo took advantage of this excitement and actually flew from High City to Los Angeles the next day. According to Elder Mo, it had been at least 10 years since he had taken a plane, and it had been 17 or 18 years since he had been to America. This time, in order to find his granddaughter-in-law, he was willing to risk his life to come to Los Angeles to reunite with them. He would stay in Los Angeles for a month before returning to High City. The television in the living room of Shine Group's CEO's office was broadcasting the news. Behind the host, there were people walking to and fro. Thanksgiving was very lively in the West. The small smiles on the passers-by's faces represented a certain festive atmosphere that slowly seeped into the night air. The familiar sound of pots and pans colliding gently came from the spare kitchen of the break room, and a pleasant aroma of food wafted out. Jinwan sniffed. And today it was sweet and sour spare ribs. She raised her head and secretly glanced at the door. Warm light shone through the crack of the door, gently passing through the dry air and shining into her eyes. The tall and straight figure who had just left a certain high-level meeting in this building 2 hours ago was holding a spatula and carefully placing the dishes on a plate. The overhead light of the kitchen and the aroma of the food slowly intertwined in her consciousness, wrapping him up and gently sending him to the bottom of her heart. The faint scent of grass on his body was mixed with the smoke of the world. She saw the nape of his neck under his black hair, which curved beautifully under the light. This great boss Missouri-come-chef Mo, who usually cooked whatever she liked to eat, had started to patiently cook for her because she had recently started to crave the taste of Chinese food again. Even though he would always complain that the smoke from Chinese food would make the house filled with smoke, her dinner would always include a few of her favorite dishes. As for the sweet and sour pork this time, she guessed that when she returned to the Mo family in Los Angeles 2 days ago, Mrs. Wanzhou had made a plate of pork ribs, but she was too embarrassed to eat too much in front of Mo Xiaozi. She only picked up 2 pieces and ate the food in front of her. It was precisely because she clearly wanted to eat but was too embarrassed to do so. She clearly did not mention this matter, but Mo Jingshan clearly saw it. While her thoughts were still wandering, he had already walked out of the kitchen. In her eyes, the sight of him holding a plate was more tempting than the steaming hot sweet and sour pork ribs. "What are you looking at?" He freed a hand to pat her head as she approached. "Go wash your hands." There was a faint fragrance on his hand, carrying the warmth she was familiar with. It was as though this extremely ordinary office break room was able to block out all the disturbances of the world. The festive atmosphere of the Westerners outside had also transformed into a warm and ordinary day by his side, peaceful and lasting. After the meal, "Come with me to the Mo family tonight." "Someone has come," Mo Jingshan suddenly said as Jinwan placed the last piece of pork ribs into her mouth. Jinwan abruptly coughed. She almost spat out the pork ribs she had just finished eating. She glanced at him in surprise. "Isn't Grandfather Mo here?" "Who else is there?" "Grandfather hasn't been to America for almost 20 years. It's rare for him to come. His old friends from back then heard the news and naturally came to visit." He placed a glass of warm milk in front of her, scolding her for being useless with his gaze. "But they're having a reunion with their old friends. Do they need us to go over?" As Jinwan spoke, she carefully pushed the glass of warm milk to the side. She wanted to push it further away when he was not paying attention. She had eaten a lot earlier. Right now, there was no space left in her stomach to hold the milk. Who was the one who said that in the future, you have to eat 2 bowls of rice, 2 bowls of vegetables, and 2 glasses of milk for every meal? You've only reached half of your goal and you can't eat any more? He noticed her small movements. Are you still complaining that you're too thin? Jinwan glanced at the milk that she had pushed further away. Tonight, she had eaten a bowl and a half of rice and an entire plate of sweet and sour pork ribs. Mo Jingshan had barely eaten, allowing her to eat them all. How could she have such a big stomach? However, this milk had been warmed by Boss Missouri with good intentions. Jinwan could only bring it back. She pretended not to notice the satisfied smile on his lips and drank more than half of the milk. The so-called reunion of Elder Mo's old friends was indeed different from what Jinwan had imagined. She had thought that it would be like what she had seen on television, where a group of old people in their 70s and 80s would stand together and sigh over the haste of life. Or perhaps they would cry because they did not know if they would ever meet again. But it was, a group of old men sat together drinking tea and chatting. Each of them wore a smile on their faces. Even Jinwan felt as though she was bathed in a spring breeze. However, she had no interest in this group of old men's mahjong table. It could even be said that she could not understand the way these old men thought. They had only met once in almost 20 years. Their after-dinner entertainment was not to sit together and cry about the past, but to play mahjong. Furthermore, there were 2 mahjong tables. Just like right now at the other table, Elder Mo and his daughter-in-law, Madame Wanzhou, were playing mahjong with 2 other old men. At this table it was Mo Xiaozi and Mo Jingshan. Jinwan watched as Mo Jingshan took off his coat. He was wearing a fitted, fine wool white sweater. The V-shaped collar revealed a gray shirt. He loosened his collar and shifted his gaze from the mahjong tiles to Jinwan, who could not wait to find something to do. He used his eyes to indicate for her to sit by his side. With so many people around, how could she have the nerve to sit so close to him? Earlier, this group of old men had not stopped mocking the 2 of them. Chapter 730. In addition, she had never seen Mo Jingshan so patiently accompanying his family and relatives. Back when they were in the Mo family in High City, Mo Jingshan had always been gentle and distant toward the group of relatives who came to suck up to the Mo family's thigh. Those people all thought that he disdained interacting with family and friends. But now, it seemed that it was only because those relatives who tried to cling on to grandfather Mo had their own motives, and Mo Jingshan really did not want to spoil them. But now he was simply helping elder Mo maintain his image. Mo Jingshan had given him enough face. It was rare for him to patiently participate in this kind of after-dinner entertainment to accompany the elderly while playing mahjong. Or perhaps, Mo Jingshan was usually too busy. Recently, because he was accompanying her to recuperate, even if he occasionally returned to Shine Group, he would only attend some important meetings. Usually he would spend more time with her. It was rare for Boss Missouri to have such free time. Seeing that Jinwan was bored to death watching by the side, Mo Jingshan touched a tile and continued to lock his gaze on her. Jinwan continued to shake her head. Although she really had nothing to do watching everyone play mahjong, she was considering if she should help the helper's pour tea. But previously, when she wanted to help, Mrs. Wanju had glared at her, indicating that there was no need for her to help and that she should rest well. Seeing that Jinwan was still standing there, Mo Jingshan narrowed his eyes and played the tile in his hand. Seeing that Mo Jingshan planned to give up after this round to accompany her, Jinwan chose to sit by his side to prevent the others from being disappointed. The man then calmly leaned against the back of the chair, indicating for Jinwan to help him touch the tile. After all, Jinwan was Mo Jingshan's wife. Everyone present was an elder. Seeing this young couple's behavior, they only smiled and did not have any objections or dissatisfaction. They only nagged, "Tisk tisk, it's really good to be young." Under everyone's gaze, Jinwan reached out her hand. In fact, her mahjong skills were very ordinary. The last time she played mahjong was in Jing City, and it was only with Xiao Li's help that she managed to win a few rounds. How much did Mo Jingshan trust her to actually let someone like her, who was not very good at mahjong, touch the tile for him? She picked up a card and touched it in her hand for a long time, but she couldn't figure out what card it was. She had no choice but to obediently hand the card to him. He's already allowing his wife to draw the cards so calmly. It seems like Jingshan is going to win this round. Anything she draws will win. The one speaking was an old man. Jinwan felt her cheeks heat up. She could let Mo Jingshan do whatever he wanted at home, but in front of a group of old people and relatives, even if she accidentally showed a little affection, she couldn't help blushing, and even the mahjong tiles in her hand became warm. She hurriedly stuffed the mahjong tiles into Mo Jingshan's hands, turning her head away in embarrassment. Mo Jingshan flipped his long fingers over the tiles. His face was expressionless as he casually pushed them down. Flowers blossomed on the bar. Everyone was shocked. "This daughter-in-law seems to be very popular with you." Everyone started to talk at once. Jinwan's face was so red that she wanted to find a hole to hide in. Thus, when everyone left in the middle of the night and returned to their rooms to rest, Jinwan's face was still red from being teased by the old men. The main reason was that these old people were used to seeing the world. After playing mahjong and drinking tea at night, when they couldn't fall asleep, they liked to talk about young people. They even discussed who would be the god-grandfather of Jinwan's child in the future, and the ranking of the god-grandfathers. Jinwan felt that there might be something wrong with her brain a while ago, which led to some unresolved problems in her brain. Otherwise, how could she, who was usually very strict, become so careless after this illness? For example, 2 nights before returning to High City from Los Angeles, there was a company reception arranged by Shine Group. Not to mention her identity as the head of MN Group, she had to attend as Mrs. Mo, who had been publicly acknowledged time and time again. However, whether in the Mo family's bedroom in Los Angeles or in the 300-square-meter lounge next to Shine Group CEO's office, these spacious spaces resulted in her often rummaging through cabinets and cabinets to look for things that she didn't know where she had left them last time. It was almost December. Although it was not Shine Group's year-end reception, it was rare for Mo Jingshan to attend it in person, so it was naturally more grand than usual. "Mo Jingshan, have you seen the white shawl I bought a few days ago?" Jinwan rummaged through the closet in the bedroom and shouted angrily at Mo Jingshan, who was outside. "I put it in the lounge after I bought it. Where did it go?" "How would I know?" CEO Mo, who was neatly dressed, looked at his watch. There was still half an hour before the reception began. "Don't rush. Take your time. We're running out of time." There was a clattering sound in the room. Mo Jingshan thought that Jinwan was going to tear down the closet door. It was not too late. It was only a 5-minute drive from here to the reception, which was enough for Jean Wan to continue looking for things. Now the only reason why she was impatient was that she had been looking for this shawl for more than an hour and still hadn't found it. "Can't you change to another one?" He watched as she ran from the master bedroom to the secondary bedroom. He suddenly seemed to have thought of something. He paused for a moment before walking over. When Jean Wan opened the secondary bedroom's closet door, it was empty, yet it seemed to be filled to the brim. A man's suit was neatly hung on the left, along with several neat shirts. By the side, there was a leather coat with an intricately patterned bronze-colored buttons. It was paired with a cane and a wide-brimmed hat. It looked slightly familiar. Wasn't this the business tycoon's outfit that Mo Jingshan wore that day in the Chinese photo studio? She heard the man's footsteps and the door closing behind her. When she turned back, she met his deep, black eyes. "Mr. Mo, do you want to explain?" She thought that he had an indescribable fondness for this kind of thing and couldn't help but deliberately glance at the closet. The man was unperturbed. "I asked someone to custom make a new set based on that one. The quality of the clothes there is too poor." Not only was he unperturbed, he even leisurely added, "Don't you like it a lot?" This time it was Jean Wan who was speechless. She stared at the man's expression, which could not be any calmer. She recalled her infatuated expression when she faced the business tycoon of the Republic of China, Mo Jingshan, and her lips couldn't help but twitch. Chapter 731. "Aren't you going to the cocktail party? What are you doing?" Jean Wan's body instinctively sounded the alarm again. When she turned around, she saw that he had locked the door to the break room. She couldn't help but ask, You're not going to the cocktail party? I'll change my clothes for you to see." The expensive necktie was casually thrown to the ground, and then he began to unbutton his shirt unhurriedly. "So that you don't have to think about it every day." Jean Wan, she did remember it. After all, Mo Jingshan usually wore normal clothes. He was either a strict CEO style or a clean and refreshing home style. It was rare for him to dress up deliberately, and it was only for the photo shoot. However, the style that time was really shocking. At that time, she even regretted that he would only wear that kind of clothes once in his life. She didn't expect that he actually noticed her regret at that time. She watched as the man's fingers moved down bit by bit, from his collarbone to his chest, and then to his slim waist. His undulating lines and perfect figure were faintly discernible under the white shirt. When the man changed into that set of clothes in front of her, Jean Wan was stunned. If one were to say that his appearance at the photo studio was enough to shock them, then right now, when Mo Jingshan wore this set of clothes made of perfect material, it completely brought out the incomparable aura that a man was born with. Seeing that the little woman's gaze was fixed on him, Mo Jingshan's lips curved slightly. "Do you like it very much?" Jean Wan nodded blankly. Perhaps because she was becoming more and more honest recently, she no longer held back her temper and said things that went against her heart. Her obedient appearance was especially moving. Before she could speak, the man had already carried her up. She was still wearing the gown that she had just changed into. In order to find a matching shawl, she had walked around the room for a long time. She had been wearing it the entire time, but when she was carried up and then placed on the soft white bed, the gown's trailing covered her body. This was a white gown, and the trailing was covered with layers of beautiful white chiffon. The white chiffon fluttered in the air with her movements and then scattered, dyeing a pure white. It was like a flawless brocade. His lips and hands were familiar with every part of her body. He explored her body with ease, and soon she was completely defeated. Before the last line of reason collapsed, she heard him whisper in her ear. His voice was dark and hoarse, and there was a hint of sluggish panting at the end. "There's no need to look for the shawl. Just change into a new one later." Jean Wan, now even if he didn't want to, he had no choice but to change. Wait a minute. She suddenly realized that it was almost time for the banquet and wanted to remind him. "What are you waiting for?" He put his hands around her disobedient waist. Jean Wan couldn't help but cry out, almost covering his soft sigh of satisfaction. Just as Jean Wan was about to lose her mind and forget the passage of time, her cell phone suddenly rang. Jean Wan originally wanted to ask him to stop, but when she saw the man reach out to pick up the phone, her remaining rationality rang in her ears, and she instinctively felt that something was wrong. "Yes, it's me. Speak." He put his index finger to his lips and gestured for her to keep quiet. Jean Wan did not expect his actions and covered her mouth to prevent herself from making a loud sound. "Mo Jingshan, are you 3 this year?" "I have time now. Take your time." Although he was still speaking into the phone, his gaze kept moving around her body. His naked desire was about to tear her apart and eat her up. His palm held her cheek, and his slender knuckles probed along her lips into her mouth. She couldn't help but let out the sound that had been suppressed in her throat. The voice on the other end of the phone was slightly muffled, and a sense of tension that she had never felt before stimulated her brain. Furthermore, this man's playful and lustful gaze moved back and forth on her body. Moving such a familiar scene between the sheets into broad daylight, it actually caused her 3 souls and 7 spirits to tremble. Jinwan even felt like she was a young girl who had just experienced the ways of the world. She was completely at a loss. However, in her heart, she hoped that the highest pleasure from her soul would engulf her. On the other end of the phone, the man continued to report with a serious expression. She fell onto the bed and was almost forced to cry. She turned her head and bit down on the corner of the blanket. Her suppressed voice had long been broken by the man's teasing. Emo. Jingshin. She heard her own voice was hoarse and choked as she called out his name. She could not take it anymore. By the time he finally hung up the phone in satisfaction, Jinwan had already suffered a crushing defeat. Her tears mixed with her messy hair covered her face. Because she had been biting down on the corner of the blanket for a long time, her lipstick had rubbed against the edge. She appeared somewhat messy and disheveled, but it also added to her seductiveness. Jinwan had always known that the pleading and weakness that she unintentionally revealed was the most effective aphrodisiac in the eyes of men. In just a moment, her entire body seemed to be brought together by his scent. Every cell in her body was engraved with his name. Those 3 words seemed to have seeped into her flesh and bones, sinking into the deepest part of her body. It was as though it could not be erased. As a result, they arrived at the hotel 2 hours late, although they were originally supposed to arrive in half an hour. Most importantly, Jinwan was picked up from the bed in an exhausted state by the man. He gave her a bath and helped her pick out a suitable set of clothes. Since they were in a rush, Jinwan did a simple hairstyle that looked very good. Just like that, Mo Jingshin directly brought her to the venue of the reception. When they arrived, a group of people from Shine Group and their business partners swarmed over. Jinwan had been tormented by this beast in human clothing until she was dispirited. When she arrived, she maintained a suitable smile. When the crowd gradually dispersed, she found a seat with fewer people and sat down. She was so tired that she did not want to speak. If it weren't for the fact that she was attending as the representative of MN Group today, she most likely would have directly fallen asleep on the bed. She definitely would not have come. However, after all, MN Group's face was here. She had worked so hard to support the company, and it was rare for it to have such an occasion in Los Angeles. It would not be appropriate for her to not come. But it was true. Good. Tired? Most importantly, not only did she not find her shawl, but he had also forcefully destroyed the gown she liked. Mo Jingshin, this beast. That. Chapter 732. Jinwan was too quiet at the cocktail party tonight. Many people came to see her because they heard that Mr. and Mrs. Mo would come in person. But apart from seeing Jinwan when they arrived, they didn't pay much attention to where she was. At this time, Jinwan was sitting on the sofa in the corner. Her back was sore and her legs were weak, so she didn't want to move. Mo Jingshin knew what state she was in, so he put his coat on her shoulders and asked her to sit there to rest. As a result, the others didn't see where Jinwan was, but when the people nearby saw her sitting there lazily, they just thought she was not feeling well or something, so they greeted her when they passed by. Jinwan also raised her hand politely to say hello, with a polite smile on her face. Jinwan didn't pay much attention until 2 young girls in the distance quietly looked toward her and whispered to each other. Jinwan didn't pay much attention to them, but she just turned to get a glass of red wine and went back to sit on the sofa. When she looked back, she saw that one of the girls in a pink evening dress was approaching Mo Jingshin with a blush. She didn't know what she was saying to Mo Jingshin, but it was not hard to see that she adored him. Jinwan glanced over there. There were many women who adored Mo Jingshin, so she was not surprised now. She saw that Mo Jingshin didn't even look at the girl but was talking to a man next to him, looking indifferent as if he didn't see the pink peacock-like girl next to him. After talking to the man next to him, he ended the conversation and walked away from her without a trace. It seemed that she was the daughter of a business partner in Los Angeles. Seeing that Mo Jingshin didn't even look at her, the girl was a little disappointed but didn't dare to approach him again. She turned around and resentfully returned to the other girl. The 2 of them seemed to be discussing something, and their eyes kept glancing in Jinwan's direction. Then they suddenly approached her, thinking that Jinwan hadn't noticed them. When they came over, they seemed to approach her unintentionally. Then the 2 of them picked up the red wine on the long table beside Jinwan, chatted with each other while drinking, and then continued to approach her. When she saw that one of the girls was about to spill the red wine on her, Jinwan sat still and said lightly, "Even if you spill the red wine on me and force me to find a place to change my clothes, even if I'm not sitting here, Mr. Mo won't look at any woman except me. I advise you not to try your luck. Otherwise even Mr. Mo won't let you off easily. After all, no matter how rich the Mo family is, this dress worth more than 1,000,000 yuan was spilled by the red wine." He has to give her an explanation. The girl who almost spilled the red wine on her stiffened and immediately steadied the glass. She glanced awkwardly at Jinwan. Jinwan didn't dare to spill the wine on her. She didn't dare to do so. However, Jinwan sat there indifferently with a casual smile in her eyes, but her eyes were cold. She had no intention of forgiving them for their misdeeds just because they were young. The two girls were indeed young and not very scheming. They just wanted to talk to Mo Jingshan, but seeing that Mr. Mo was too cold, they thought it was inconvenient for him to communicate with other girls because his wife was here, so they took the opportunity to send Mrs. Mo away and see if Mo Jingshan would talk to them. However, to their surprise, the two girls looked at each other awkwardly and put down the wine glasses. "Mrs. Mo, you're thinking too much. I didn't hold it steady just now. Fortunately, Mrs. Mo reminded me. Otherwise, I might have accidentally spilled it on you. I'm sorry." One of the girls turned to Jinwan and apologized awkwardly. Jinwan's expression remained unchanged. She was neither cold nor indifferent, nor did she put on a condescending air. She just looked back at them indifferently and said flatly, "I can understand the young lady's yearning for love, but in your eyes Mr. Mo is already a married man who has been married for many years. I suggest you change the direction of your yearning. It's not a good thing to want to hook up with another man's husband at such a young age." The two girls immediately blushed. We didn't mean that, you'd better not." Jinwan gently curved her lips, but her smile did not reach her eyes. "There's nothing wrong with being simple, but under normal circumstances, I won't be polite to those who have such thoughts. After being married for so many years, I've seen all kinds of women. Some young girls who are too straightforward can be trampled to death like ants crossing the street. At such a young age, why do you want to make others unhappy and harm yourself and others at the same time?" The two girls looked a little embarrassed. However, this person was Mrs. Mo after all, so they didn't dare to quarrel or do anything else. And Mrs. Mo clearly saw through them, which was why she said such words. In this case, if they continued to argue, they would not be in the right and would definitely be at a disadvantage. The two girls did not dare to say anything more. They looked at each other, stuck out their tongues and turned to leave quickly, not daring to stay any longer. Jinwan was not affected by this little episode at all. She still sat in the same place and took a sip of red wine from time to kill time. Less than 10 minutes later, Mo Jingshan came back and helped Jinwan up from the sofa. He whispered in her ear with a smile, "Are you still very tired?" The man's voice was very low and light and only she could hear it. Jinwan glanced at him, accusing him with her eyes. Of course, he had tortured her so much before coming to the party. It would be strange if she had the strength now. Recently he had not stopped almost every night. It was as if he wanted to make up for the pain he had suffered in the past 3 years of abstinence. At this moment there were people dancing at the party. Mo Jingshan held Jinwan's hand in the crowd and did not go over to join in the fun. He let go of her hand and turned to hold her waist, drawing her into his arms and lowered his head to look at her. "I heard that Mrs. Mo said harsh words to someone today. If anyone dares to have any thoughts about Mr. Mo, you definitely won't be polite to them, right?" Chapter 733. Mo Jingshan was very satisfied with the news that came out of the two girls' mouths. Jinwan calmly looked at the people in the dance hall and said, "If I were standing here today as the head of MN Group, I might be able to avoid any disputes and protect my company's image, but now I'm Mrs. Mo. Some girls even want to step on my head. Do I look like I'm easy to bully?" How could Jinwan be easy to bully? She had never been easy to bully. But she did deal with things according to the situation and the people. Mo Jingshan smiled in satisfaction. His hand tightened around her waist. "With Mrs. Mo around, we can indeed avoid a lot of trouble. Are those little girls who come because of your reputation trouble? I thought Mr. Mo actually likes them very much." Jinwan deliberately teased him. The man's palm stroked her waist, and his voice was so low and husky that only she could hear it. "Don't you know what I like, Mrs. Mo?" "Jinwan," she immediately gave the man a reproachful look, but the man chuckled and lifted the coat on her back. "If you're tired, go back and rest early. Tonight is just a formality. You don't have to be here the whole time. Jean Wan grunted in response, but she did not leave so thoughtlessly. After all, she was already late. If she left early, it would be inappropriate. She knew this in her heart. As the CEO of MN Group and the wife of the CEO of Shine Group, no matter how much Mo Jingshan spoiled her, she had to be responsible for her words and actions. She used to be the Mrs. Mo that Mo Jingshan doted on, but now she was the Mrs. Mo that could stand side by side with him. Why is life so fortunate to be able to live with the person you love? The memories of two lives are related to you. Jean Wan was 25 years old, and Mo Jingshan was 30 years old. A month later, shortly after Jean Wan and Mo Jingshan's vacation began, she was called back to High City by Xia Tian to deal with the company's new project, mainly because Xia Tian's baby caught a cold. It was the first time the baby had a fever since she was born, which frightened Xia Tian, who was known as a strong woman in the business world. It was said that at 3 o'clock in the morning, Xia Tian was so anxious that she couldn't fall asleep. She rushed to the hospital overnight and refused to let go of the baby. The doctors in the hospital, on the other hand, had long been used to it. After arranging the fever patches, anti-inflammatory drugs, and so on, they said that it was normal for the baby to have a fever and didn't need to worry, and then left the consulting room. Every time Xia Tian mentioned this thrilling night, the colleagues in the company who had long been mothers would have a common topic. They all said that when their baby had a fever for the first time, they were all frightened. They all said that the baby had a fever and had a fever. But later they became more experienced, and they were very calm even when the baby had a fever. Half a month after Jean Wan returned to High City, she was oppressed by Xia Tian and her colleagues in the company. Every day she was urged to have a baby. It had only been 2 months since she became clear-headed and recovered. It couldn't be that fast. Jean Wan was not in a hurry at all. As time went by, Mo Jingshan's birthday came. Jean Wan was actually a stubborn person. She didn't remember many festivals and anniversaries as clearly as other women. She thought about it carefully. It seemed that she hadn't specially celebrated Mo Jingshan's birthday for so many years. So a week before his birthday she casually mentioned it to Xia Tian and Xiao Ba, but on the day of his birthday she completely forgot about it. It wasn't until Xia Tian and Xiao Ba took her to the mall to buy things that she remembered it, but it was already the afternoon of the same day. She clearly remembered that when she got up in the morning, Mo Jingshan was the same as usual. It seemed that even he had forgotten about it. But 30 years old, was a full 10, and it was also the beginning of a man's most handsome and charming age. If she really didn't celebrate his birthday for him, it would be too unreasonable of her to do so. But as for the suggestion to wrap herself up as a birthday present, she very much rejected it. After all, this kind of thing was really too embarrassing. In particular, under the suggestion of the company's various employees, Xia Tian and Xiao Ba forcibly took Jean Wan to the mall and dragged her into a lingerie shop to try on a set of sexy lingerie. And it was the kind with cat ears. What on earth were these two women thinking? In order to make her quickly give birth to a child, they couldn't wait to send her to Mo Jingshan's bed every day, right? She silently hooked the hairband of the cat ears with her index finger and looked at the two women who didn't want to make things worse. Xiao Ba, boss, if you really don't know what gift to give him, just sell your body. No matter what, CEO Mo has always been so good to you. If you take the initiative to flirt with him, even if he eats you clean, you won't lose out. Anyway, you're husband and wife. If you want to eat him clean, you've already eaten him clean. Jean Wan, Xia Tian, that's right. When it's time to make a move, you have to make a move. Tell me, when have you taken the initiative in front of Mo Jingshan? If you deliberately flirt with him, seduce him, do you think the usually calm and collected CEO Mo will directly have a nosebleed? Jean Wan? It was possible that she would have a nosebleed. Xiao Ba, boss, you can do it. Xia Tian, you can do it. Bravely wear it back for him to see. Jean Wan, who could help her chase these two crazy women out? In the end, Jean Wan still succumbed to their power and had no choice but to buy the set of clothes back. Originally, she had a business meeting at the company. Xia Tian and the others said that there was no need for her to go, but this time, the business partner she had to meet was very important. Jean Wan put on a serious expression and insisted on returning home after the business meeting. The matter of celebrating Mo Jingshan's birthday was directly thrown to the back of her mind. And then the result was, when she returned home, it was already past 11 o'clock p.m. There was still half an hour before Mo Jingshan's birthday party ended. Recently, the two of them had been staying at Aolan International and did not return to the U Garden. She quietly pushed open the door and saw that it was pitch black. She finally released a long sigh of relief in her heart. Although Mo Jingshan had been very busy after returning to High City, he should be able to understand her coming home a little later today. After all, everyone had work to do, although the scope of her a little later seemed a little too wide. Jinwan carefully removed her high heels and tiptoed into the bedroom like a thief. Pa! The living room lights turned on. She was startled and immediately straightened up. She happened to see Mo Jingshan standing in the middle of the living room with his arms crossed and a heavy expression. Chapter 734. Why didn't you turn on the lights? Jinwan softly muttered. What do you think? Mo Jingshan was dressed in dark blue home clothes, but it did not diminish his imposing aura. How would I know? Jinwan fearlessly replied. After speaking, she buried her head as though afraid that Mo Jingshan, who had a terrible birthday, would beat her in the next second. What made her feel even more guilty was the equipment she was wearing under her clothes. Earlier, after returning from the business meeting, she was forcefully dragged into the break room by Xiao Ba and Xia Tian to change her clothes. Then he came back wearing the clothes he had bought during the day. He only had a white cashmere coat on the outside. While changing, Jinwan's heart was already wailing. Who could tell her why was there a collar on this kinky lingerie? Why was there a bell on the collar? These two women. Deducting her wages. At that time, she stood in front of the mirror with a red face and indignantly tied the bell around her neck. She then wrapped a thick scarf tightly around her neck to ensure that there would not be any jingling sounds when she walked. But to be honest, right now she only felt suffocated. His slippers stepped on the wooden floor silently. She could only see Mo Jingshan's slender legs approaching her dangerously. A week ago you specially reminded me to celebrate my birthday. It's rare for me to remember this day clearly and come back early. In the end, this is the birthday you want to celebrate for me? Mo Jingshan stopped 10 centimeters away from her. His slightly hoarse voice rang above her head, filled with a hint of anger. Without raising her head, she could tell what his expression was like. Should be very bad. That's right, a week ago she had specially mentioned that he was about to celebrate his 30th birthday. Mo Jingshan said that he rarely celebrated his birthday and did not need to do anything, but she said that he had to celebrate his 30th birthday. Thus he had remembered this matter. In the blink of an eye, the person who had spent almost all the 24 hours of the day was her. Jinwan wanted to refute but was forced back by Mo Jingshan's pressing body. Cough, it's my fault. I have a business meeting tonight, so... She had better obediently admit her mistake. After all, today was the birthday boy's birthday. However, when she decided to lower her head and admit her mistake, Mo Jingshan stared at her neck for a long time. She felt that the great CEO Mo seemed to be stunned for a few seconds. He looked at her tightly wrapped cashmere coat with an unclear meaning, but in the end, he still turned to the side and allowed her to enter the house. The air conditioner was turned on in the room, and it was so warm that it even made her feel a little hot. She subconsciously wanted to take off her coat and scarf, but when she thought of the outfit inside, she swallowed her saliva and decided to stay calm. She shouldn't have worn it. She must be crazy to have been encouraged by Xiao Ba and Xia Tian to wear such a thing. Mo Jingshan closed the door and went to the kitchen to pour 2 glasses of water. The food on the table was already cold. He clearly had no intention of letting her eat. He came to sit by her side and handed her the water. Seeing that she was still wearing such a thick coat and scarf, he asked calmly, "Aren't you hot?" "It's not hot, it's not hot. It's cold." He touched her cheeks that were even redder because of the heat. He raised his brows and was about to say something when Jinwan subconsciously reached out to cover his mouth. "I'm fine, really?" His warm breath landed on her fingers. It was soft. After being husband and wife for so long, Jinwan finally realized that ever since she was reborn and took the initiative to seduce Mo Jingshan, it seemed like this man had always been the one taking the initiative. Regardless of what it was, even on the bed, he always stood in the dominant position. This was the first time she had done such a thing. She could not help but feel a little guilty. The moment her hand touched his lips, she rushed to pull it back. However, the man covered her hand with his, moving it to his lips for a light kiss. He then let her do as she pleased. Jinwan stared at his handsome face in a daze. She was even slightly dazed. Such a good man, a man that so many women drooled over, how did he become her man? "What are you thinking about?" He held her hand. Seeing that she was staring at him in a daze, he used some force to call back her wandering thoughts. "I'm thinking that there's only a little time left before midnight. What should I do to make up for your 30th birthday?" She spread her fingers apart and intertwined them with his. His long, slender fingers felt even hotter against her face. He held her hand and watched her face. He did not speak, nor did he reprimand her for returning too late. Just as Jinwan thought he was about to say something, his other hand suddenly wrapped around her waist and pulled her into his embrace. "It's good that you're home safely. If you were any later, I'm afraid I would have sent bodyguards to your company to search for you." This man was really constantly worried about her safety. He did not plan to pursue the matter of her not celebrating his birthday with him. Jinwan leaned into his embrace, her fingers tracing the lines on his clothes. She closed her eyes to feel his steady heartbeat and softly said, "What could possibly happen to me? Unless someone is drooling over my beauty again." The man chuckled lightly. Outside the window, fine snow drifted down slowly. The room was as quiet as a dream. However, this was a dream. It was 2F King hot. The clothes and scarf that were too thick for the room made it increasingly difficult for her to breathe. Her eyes seemed to be covered by a thin layer of mist. Even Mo Jingshin, who was so close to her, could not see clearly. She turned her face slightly and rubbed her eyes, trying to rub away the mist. However, it was counterproductive and her vision became increasingly blurry. Mo Jingshin sensed her movements and raised his eyes to carefully watch her reddening face. "What's wrong with you?" To Jinwan's slightly flushed skin, his palm was slightly cold and extremely comfortable. She subconsciously rubbed against it. When she heard his words, she suddenly remembered the clothes she had specially worn for him and immediately bounced up from his lap. It's all right. I'll go wash my face." After speaking, she immediately carried it into the bathroom. The full-length mirror in the bathroom reflected the woman wrapped in a thick coat and scarf. Her face was crimson, reflecting her dark and clear eyes, making her look somewhat beautiful. She tugged at her scarf. After hesitating for a moment, she untied it and put it in her bag. The bell on her neck jingled as she moved. Listening to the sound, she sniffled and blinked at the mirror. She felt that this was a completely different feeling from the time when she kept winking at the mirror during the wedding photo shoot. One time she was just doing it for the photo shoot and the other was for real. Mo Jingshin stood in the living room. Hearing the movements inside, he walked over and opened the bathroom door. However, Jinwan, who had already taken off her coat, was standing inside. She was about to come out when their eyes met. Chapter 735. When Jinwan said these words, it happened to be 12 o'clock. Thankfully she made it in time. However, the man stood outside the bathroom door, staring at her as she walked out. Jinwan did not have the courage to raise her head. After speaking, she lowered her head and looked at his slippers. She was so nervous that she could barely hear her own breathing. She then added in a small voice, "Happy birthday, Mo Jingshin. Those who don't know might think that my slippers are called Mo Jingshin." There was a smile in his eyes. He raised his hand to rub her hair, chuckling softly. "Look into my eyes." Jinwan reached out to remove his hand from her hair. She raised her head to glare at him. The shyness in her heart was truly unbearable. She could not help but bring his hand to her lips and bite down hard, trying to vent her nervousness. However, the man raised his brows and glanced at her before releasing her. However, he did not let go of her hand. Instead, he carried her in his arms. With a pious expression as though he was about to open a present, he carried her into the bedroom. Jinwan's face was red the entire time. There was no need to say more. They had been husband and wife for so long. He could easily tell why she was dressed like this, what she was thinking, and how shy she was. The bedroom was slightly dark. Mo Jingshin carried her to the bed and sat down. He placed her on his lap and wrapped his hands around hers, holding them gently in his palms. Jinwan felt that the redness on her face that had just faded was beginning to heat up again. She raised her head to glance at his expression. She suddenly felt that perhaps she was dressed too much like a kitten today. It was rare that this man did not transform into a beast. Instead, he was so gentle and patient, as though he wanted to put her in his eyes and melt her away. Anyway, her clothes had already been changed. The plan to use her as a birthday present was already halfway done. No matter how embarrassed she was, it seemed like there was no need. Jinwan closed her eyes and leaned forward to kiss the corner of the man's lips. Because of her action, Mo Jingshin chuckled. Just as Jinwan was about to move away, he pressed the back of her head to prevent her from leaving. His lips and tongue pressed down on hers. "Did you eat at the dinner party tonight?" His kiss landed on the corner of her mouth. His low, husky voice made her heart tremble. He still did not forget to care about her. Jinwan made a muffled end sound. "I did." "Then it's my turn." She didn't react for a moment. When she understood, she was pressed into the bed by the man who was no longer gentle. When Jinwan learned that the floors above her residence in Yuehu Bay belonged to Mo Jingshan, she was not surprised at all. At first she didn't think of it, but later she gradually felt that there was such an ability to ensure her safety without being discovered, and there were so many strange coincidences everywhere. After thinking carefully, she guessed it was Mo Jingshan, but she didn't dare to be too sure. When she was about to go out with Mo Jingshan to finish her unfinished vacation, the housekeeper from Yuehu Bay came to deliver the clothes she wanted to take out. She recognized the housekeeper as the one on the 16th floor, and the answer was self-evident. She had questioned Mo Jingshan about this matter. However, Great Boss Missouri had replied indifferently, at that time, there were too many people chasing after her. If he didn't despicably separate those who wanted to be neighbors with her, she would have been cheated away by others before he could do anything. Even if there was only a 1 in 10,000 chance, he couldn't let it go. Look, even Mo Jingshan himself admitted how despicable he was. Fortunately, Jinwan had guessed it, but she wasn't sure. Now that she thought about it, she finally understood why Mr. Vince had repeatedly applied for the house in Yuehu Bay but had been rejected. Tiske. She really couldn't tell that Mo Jingshan was even more shameless than she had imagined. No, she had seen his even more shameless side. What was there to be surprised about? As the saying went, all businessmen were cunning. If Mo Jingshan wasn't shameless or despicable, how could he have become a fearsome existence in the business world? However, when Jinwan checked the house in Yuehu Bay, she also checked the relationship between the house and herself. It turned out that long before she moved in, the entire several floors of Yuehu Bay's properties had been transferred to her name, which meant that the houses worth hundreds of millions of yuan were all hers. At the same time, Jinwan checked the assets under her name, only to find that Ling Xiao Group had ceded part of its assets to her before she came to her senses. Half of Xiao Jinjuan's private property had also been transferred to her name. Although Jinwan didn't plan to accept it, she also asked the legal department and a lawyer to return these things that didn't belong to her. However, before doing so, she counted all the assets under her name, took a screenshot and sent a photo to Mo Jingshan. Jinwan, am I now the richest woman in China? The Ji family, the Xiao family and MN Group's money added together should be enough, right? However, Mo Jingshan's reply to her was, tomorrow I'll transfer all the assets under my name to you. You'll be the richest woman in China. There's no need to add the word, woman. Jinwan? I don't want to. I'll return the Xiao family's assets to them as soon as possible. And I don't need the Ji family's assets. My father can manage the company for at least another 20 or 30 years. I don't want to take on so many responsibilities. MN Group is enough to make me anxious. She didn't need the title of the richest woman. Just the 3 words Mrs. Emma were enough. Jinwan's vacation in London, Greece, Egypt and all over the world began again, but as soon as she returned from Egypt, she had to stop. Because recently, wherever she went, she vomited. She couldn't hold on any longer and was forced to go to the hospital by Mo Jingshan. It turned out that she was already more than a month pregnant. When she did an ultrasound examination, she found that there were 2 small things in her belly for more than a month. No wonder her morning sickness was so severe. She was actually pregnant with 2. When she saw the 2 small indistinct images on the ultrasound, Jinwan didn't expect it at all. But the smile on Mo Jingshan's face didn't disappear from beginning to end. At night, when she went to bed, Jinwan leaned against Mo Jingshan's arms. All day long, she would often look at the ultrasound to make sure she wasn't dreaming and that she was really pregnant with 2 babies. When she finally fell asleep, Mo Jingshan stroked her hair and said softly, all that you've lost one day will come back to you in another way. Chapter 736. 1 year later. Ding dang dang dang. In the morning, Jinwan was still dreaming in bed when her phone alarm began to ring. She narrowed her eyes and searched for her phone. When she opened it, she saw the 2 words on the alarm clock, feed. This was an automatic reminder from her phone every morning. The 2 babies needed to be fed 150 milliliters of milk powder or breast milk each after they woke up. The Mo family had specially hired a nutritionist to arrange a daily feeding method according to the weight and condition of the 2 babies. It was said that this method of mixing milk powder and breast milk was very beneficial for the growth of the twins born at the same time. However, this alarm could only serve as a wake-up call for Jinwan. It had been 3 months since the birth of Mo Jinan and Mo Jining. As long as she didn't have to hold and feed the babies, the family basically didn't ask her to do anything. Mrs. Wanzhou had specially flown from Los Angeles to High City to personally take care of the babies for more than 2 months. Recently she had to fly back to America due to some matters. At home there was a nanny arranged by grandfather Mo, but as long as Auntie Chen was around, there was basically no room for others to interfere. The names N and Ning Ning were given by elder Mo. The old man only hoped that the babies would grow up healthily and peacefully. On the day these two little things were born, when he learned that they were a boy and a girl, the old man leaned on his walking stick outside the delivery room and was so excited that tears streamed down his old face. In the first few days he didn't even sleep. He just sat by the small bed and watched the two little guys drink their fill and sleep, not even willing to blink. Originally, when the old man learned that Jinwan was pregnant, he was overjoyed and said that he would love it no matter if it was a boy or a girl. He didn't expect that in the end, this little girl not only got pregnant, but also gave birth to a pair of twins. The old man was so happy that he seemed to have suddenly become 20 years younger. And then was the elder brother. He was born half a minute earlier than Ning Ning. The two babies looked a little small when they were born, but they could eat and sleep well in the past 3 months. They were white and chubby and were especially lovable. Except for crying a few times when they were hungry, they were obedient and never cried at other times. They were so young and didn't know anything, but as long as an adult held them and teased them, the two children would especially cooperate and giggle, which made the whole Mo family treat the two children as treasures and like them very much. Not only the Mo family, but the Ji family and the Xiao family also couldn't help but come to the Yu Garden to see the children again and again. Jinwan didn't refuse or stop them. After all, although she had the right to choose her father, she didn't have the right to choose a grandfather for the children. Besides, even if there were two grandfathers it didn't matter. They were both good to the children. When Jinwan was pregnant with two babies at once, she suffered a lot during the 9 months of pregnancy. After the baby was born, except for feeding the baby, Mo Jingshan didn't ask her to intervene in anything else and only asked her to rest. So her usual state in the Yu Garden was, Mo Jingshan was either in the study because of work or taking care of the children with Auntie Chen. Mo Jingshan even fed the two children more than Jinwan. Although breast milk was necessary, the two little things were too big and had to be fed with milk powder. Moreover, the two little things especially liked to drink milk powder in their father's arms. Every time they drank milk, they would stare at their father with round eyes and smile. But when they drank milk in Jinwan's arms, they ate and slept at the same time. They didn't give her any face at all. Now Mo Jingshan, the global CEO of Shine Group, had become very good at making milk powder for the children. Even Jinwan couldn't control the temperature of the water well and often made mistakes in the order of pouring milk powder and water into the bottle, but Mo Jingshan was obviously much more professional than her. Jinwan could only put on Mo Jingshan's nightgown every day, nestled on the sofa in the Yu Garden, holding a fruit plate and eating all kinds of nutritious nuts and fruits. Other mothers complained that they were busy and tired after becoming mothers, but since she gave birth to the babies, she was so idle that she was about to go moldy. The company gave her a year of maternity leave, and MN Group was now managed by someone. There was no need for her to interfere at home. Sometimes she looked at her phone. Sometimes she watched TV. Sometimes, she looked at Mo Jingshan. Most of the time, Mo Jingshan's mind was on her and the children. Many of the company's unfinished business were sent to the Yu Garden by Shinmu for him to review. When he finished feeding the children and turned to answer the company's call, he allowed Jinwan's gaze to move from his face to his collarbone and then to his chest. She did not even let go of the joints of his fingers. She stared at him back and forth 800 times. Occasionally he would raise his head from the company's documents and reports. In the end, under Jinwan's pitiful attack, he gave in and allowed her to hold the children for a while. In fact, the reason why Mo Jingshan asked her to hold the children as little as possible was because Auntie Chen had said that many women were prone to postpartum illness after giving birth. Most of them had back pain from holding the children. Even though Jinwan's postpartum period had long passed, she had given birth to 2 children at once. In order not to leave her with any uncomfortable symptoms, Mo Jingshan did not allow her to do anything that was too tiring. Even when she fed the children, she had to limit the time and was not allowed to hold them for too long. Usually, under Jinwan's aggressive gaze, Mo Jingshan would allow her to hold the children for a while. Jinwan obtained the opportunity to hold the babies and Daddy Mo, once again, obtained the opportunity to make 2 bottles of milk powder for the children. After sleeping peacefully, Jinwan carried Ning Ning, who was awake on the small bed. She walked around the kitchen with the children in her arms and turned to see the man who was measuring the water temperature inside. His actions were completely unlike the aloof, noble and unapproachable CEO of Shine Group. If his current appearance was posted on the company's website, it would most likely cause an uproar in the industry. Who would have thought that the all-powerful CEO Mo in the business world would be labeled as such a warm man at home? Auntie Chin went out to buy groceries and there were only the two of them at home. On weekdays, as long as the babies fell asleep, Auntie Chin and the servants in the Yew garden would intentionally or unintentionally leave them alone. After all, as long as Mr. Mo was at home after work, there would be no problem even if they were not at home. What do you want to eat tonight? After making the milk powder, the man did not look back but asked her patiently and gently. Chapter 737. As she spoke, Jinwan carried the 3-month-old Mo Jinning, who was already plump and fair. She turned and said as she walked, "Daddy is going to cook, be good and go to the little bed to drink milk. Otherwise, Mommy won't be able to eat dinner and can only drink your milk powder." Mo Jingshan was extremely disgusted by Jinwan's threatening the child. However, right now, he was even more shocked by her shameless act of snatching milk from the baby. "Are you hungry or what?" She did not know where he had conjured a small piece of dessert. At the same time he rubbed her head. His actions were the same as when she held the child to feed him. Satisfied, Jinwan held the child and the dessert in her arms and returned to the living room. At the same time she looked back with the spoon on the dessert in her mouth and happened to catch the tenderness in Mo Jingshan's eyes that he couldn't retract. She thought about how she had spent the entire afternoon either drinking Auntie Chen's food or sitting on the sofa watching TV while eating fruits and snacks. Jinwan reflected on herself for a moment. She bit the spoon and asked, "Have I been eating too much recently?" She did not gain much weight when she was pregnant. In the past 3 months she had lost a lot of weight. However, according to Auntie Chen, she should eat more to look better. Jinwan took advantage of the fact that she was still breastfeeding and did not need to worry about her figure. She ate more and more every day but she still did not gain weight. The man smiled mildly. "No matter how much you eat, I can still afford to raise you." In the blink of an eye, Mo Jinan and Mo Jinning were 1.5 years old. The Spring Festival, the 5th day of the year, was the day to welcome the God of Wealth. However, their God of Wealth had gone to shine to work overtime. Auntie Chin and the helpers were busy making dumplings, leaving Jinwan alone with An and Ning Ning staring at each other. And she had big eyes while the two of them had small eyes. Right now this little thing's face was not even the size of a palm. Even if his eyes were as black and big as grapes, they would not be bigger than hers. It was fine to compare now, but in a few years she would not compare with them anymore. Especially Ning Ning. She was a girl and her features were like a miniature version of herself. However, she could not tell which part of her was prettier than her. Perhaps it was because Ning Ning often looked like Mo Jingshan? On the other hand, An's facial features were especially similar to his father's. He had been a handsome boy since he was young, but there were some expressions between his eyebrows that occasionally resembled her. The two children clearly felt different from each other, but every time they were put together, they seemed to be especially similar. Therefore, human genes were really powerful and magical. They could concentrate the strengths of their parents on their children, and it was as if two different people had completely merged into one. That night, by the time the family's god of fortune, Boss Missouri, returned from overtime, it was already after dinner. The company had an urgent matter that required him to personally make a decision, so he had no choice but to return a little late. However, when he returned home, he specially bought 3 servings of children's yogurt and lollipops to express his apology. 2 of them were baby yogurt and there were also handmade milk lollipops without additives. It was definitely not a problem for babies to eat. The one for Jinwan was made of the same material, but the larger version had the sweetness of fruit candy. All in all, in his eyes, Jinwan's position was similar to An and Ning Ning's. They were both children who needed to be coaxed. Even if he came home an hour late, he had to quickly coax her to prevent his wife from being unhappy. Seeing that Boss Missouri had such self-awareness, Jinwan was happy to not have to worry. She held the lollipops and ate them happily. After the Spring Festival, Mo Shaoza and Madame Wanzhou missed their children too much in America. They wanted to bring the child to America to stay for 2 to 3 months. Auntie Chen was used to taking care of the child and was worried, so she followed the child to America. Ever since the child was picked up by his grandparents, Jinwan finally had some free time to work at the company. After work, she wandered around the various pet markets out of boredom. She looked for all kinds of beautiful kittens, thinking that one day she would be able to live the life of a winner with both a child and a cat. Unexpectedly, when she bought a white rag doll and brought it home for the first time, Mr. Mo, who had rushed home, bumped into her at the door. They looked at each other in silence. He used his eyes to indicate for her to speak first. Jinwan swallowed her saliva, feeling a little nervous. His expression was so serious that it was as if the words "I'll let you run 39 meters first" were written on his face. "I want to raise it." She raised her head, puffed out her chest, and went straight to the point. "No." The man was resolute and decisive. "This month I'll definitely eat half a bowl of rice every night." She began to settle for the next best thing. "Is there a point?" he asked in disdain. "I'll wear that sexy cat-eared lingerie that you like so much to warm your bed for a week." In times of crisis, people could be shameless just like Jean Wan. 1 month. The man was insatiable. 2 weeks. She bargained. 2 months. "Mr. Mo, why didn't you play by the rules?" 1-month deal. In the end, Jean Wan could only grit her teeth in humiliation. Just like that, a new member was added to the family. Jean Wan named the ragdoll Mo Xiaoshan. Every time she called the cat, Mo Jingshan would subconsciously raise his head and pretend to cough before burying his attention back into the pile of documents. Mo Dashan, to think that you would have such a day." Jean Wan's favorite time was every morning when she secretly opened her eyes. At that time, the sun had just climbed out of the horizon. Mo Jingshan punctually appeared in the open kitchen on the 2nd floor, unhurriedly making breakfast for the babies who had returned home. Sometimes, in order not to wake her up, he would close the bedroom door tightly when he left. Thus, Jean Wan quietly got up and peeked through the crack in the door to see that he had prepared Ning Ning's breakfast. He then cut the fresh fish into small pieces and placed them on a plate. He casually placed it in front of Mo Xiaoshan and got up to continue washing his hands. The rising sun tore apart the curtain of the night. With a slowly awakening warmth, it gently climbed over his shoulders and plated his body with a warm layer of gold. He turned around in the sunlight, and she saw his dark eyes brimming with love that only she knew. End of text. It's over. Thanks to the baby's support, Mo Tuchuan and Jean Wan's story has come to a successful end. But the end is the beginning. I will send you a fragrant new novel as soon as possible. But recently, I should focus on writing about Nan Heng and Feng Ling's side story. After all, this is also a very interesting story about a woman disguised as a man that I have been looking forward to for a long time. In my eyes, this pair is actually the main CP, not the secondary CP. After all, a woman disguised as a man is one of my favorite themes. Because Nan Heng has always been relatively mysterious and has not appeared in many scenes, the content of the plot will not be limited by the main plot and the timeline. It can definitely be regarded as a wonderful new novel, the kind that is very doting, very exciting, and will definitely not let everyone down. The side stories updates are also no less than 6,000 words per day. For those who are not sure whether to follow the side story or not, they can first read the plot tomorrow and continue to follow it if they like it. Nan Heng's side story introduction. The little disciple who used to eat and sleep with me, and who was kicked off the bed by me many times because she never took off her clothes when sleeping with me. I spent several years training this boy, but she suddenly became a girl. Now I can't face the 2 buns on her chest. What should I do? I'm waiting online urgently. Chapter 738. Go away. Feng Ling abruptly kicked away the 2 doctors around the bed, but at the moment when she got up, she fell back on the bed because she had just been injected with a tranquilizer. Seeing her stubborn look, the doctor said to the person next to him, "Look at this child's temper. He refuses to accept treatment even when he is injured. How can he live in the orphanage in the future? You are kind enough to accept him, but I don't think he wants to appreciate your kindness." The director of an international orphanage in Los Angeles did not speak at first, and then looked thoughtfully at the 12-year-old child on the bed. This child was a member of an underground mafia group that the American police wiped out half a month ago. He was young and an orphan. According to the police, this child was named Feng Ling. When he was 5 years old, his boss found him in a wolf cave on the mountain. At that time, Feng Ling could not speak and could only bark. He was a baby raised by wolves. When he was 5 years old, his boss took him away and trained him to be their puppet. Because of his young age, he was not guarded by the enemy when he went out on missions, and he had the shrewdness and decisiveness of a wolf. Even though he was young, he was trusted by his boss. Because of his young age and the way he grew up, the police believed that his nature should not be bad because of the environment he grew up in, so they did not put him on the criminal list and only sent him to the orphanage. When Feng Ling was sent in, his body was covered with wounds, but if the doctor hadn't given him a tranquilizer, the room would have been torn apart by him. 1 year later, Feng Ling sensed that something was wrong. She abruptly opened her eyes, only to see a little girl in a pink dress standing by his bed with a curious expression. She was holding a flower in her hand and staring at him with a red face. In a trance, Feng Ling moved his hand and felt that the amount of tranquilizer the doctor gave him this morning was not much. After a year of drug control, she had no extra energy every day and could only get up to eat and walk at most. This was the method that the director of the orphanage came up with. He kept her in order to cooperate with the police, but did not allow her to have too much energy to make trouble. He arranged her alone in a dark and depressing room, where she could only see the stars through the small lattice window. "Brother Feng Ling, why do you sleep alone in the small room every day?" The little girl by the bed grew up in an orphanage. She was only 12 or 13 years old, but she seemed to know what it meant to like someone. When she looked at Feng Ling, her eyes were watery and full of expectation. Feng Ling ignored him and got off the bed. Feng Ling had always lived in this room alone. She was used to such darkness and looked at the mirror. The youth in the mirror was tall and slender. Even though he was only 13 years old, he looked much taller than many of his peers. His face was pale and cold, and his eyes were so bright that even the stars outside the window couldn't compare. His messy, jet-black hair looked slightly dispirited. With a casual flick, his short hair instantly looked much more supple and docile. The little girl was dumbfounded as she watched from the side. Feng Ling was the best-looking boy in the orphanage, but he usually didn't like to interact with others or make friends. No matter when he was eating or being called to group classes by the teachers of the orphanage, he would always sit in the corner coldly and quietly. He had a completely unapproachable temper. The boys especially hated him because almost all the girls liked to sneak glances at him. Even if he had a bad temper, the girls would always find opportunities to approach him, although every time they tried they would get cold indifference. Although this beautiful boy's temper was really cold, there seemed to be deep whirlpools in his eyes, like stars in the darkness, bright and dazzling. He was so beautiful, but he was not as annoying as other boys. He always came and went alone. The black earring on the boy's ear seemed to carry a sharp dark light, mysterious and unfathomable. Feng Ling closed his eyes, and the extraordinarily beautiful boy in the mirror also closed his eyes. "Brother Feng Ling, do you want to go eat with me? I heard that the cook made hamburgers today." Hearing the shy and noisy voice of the little girl, Feng Ling frowned impatiently. "Shut up and get out." The little girl should have been afraid, but she had long known his temper, so she walked over and handed him the flower in her hand nervously. "Brother Feng Ling, I just want to be friends with you, Feng Ling's eyes opened instantly. In this dim and narrow room, it was like a dagger lurking in the dark for a long time, making people shudder. He glanced at her coldly, and the little girl was frightened by his eyes. She immediately dropped the flower, turned around and staggered out. The room was quiet again, and the boy in front of the mirror looked indifferent. When she was taken out of a wolf's cave at the age of 5, she knew that she was not a wolf, but a human, and gradually understood that she was a girl. But in the world of the mafia, she had to dress up as a boy to be able to move freely. She had to train and carry out tasks as a boy to have food. Otherwise she could only be killed as trash. If she wanted to live, she could only forget the fact that she was a girl. As time went by, even she couldn't remember whether she was a man or a woman. She remembered that when she was in the hands of the mafia, she once sneaked into the headquarters of the FBI to install a listening device. Many American police had dispatched a large number of police cars in order to catch her, but she still managed to escape. Even a few strong police officers were no match for her. But she never expected that in the past year she was controlled here by these so-called doctors who saved the dying and helped the wounded with a tranquilizer a day. The front door of the orphanage was rarely open, and 3 or 4 tall top-grade military Hummers were parked outside. The door was opened. "Boss." A member of 11 Base who was about to finish his service stood in front of the door and looked respectfully and solemnly at the man who got out of the car. "Here we are." Nan Hung responded indifferently and walked in. Seeing that the rumored Nan Hung finally appeared, the director of the orphanage hurried to greet him. "Mr. Lee, it was your father who came here to select people a few years ago. Today is the first time I see you, Mr. Lee. Please forgive me for my negligence." Chapter 739. Yes, but Mr. Lee, you are the person in charge of 11 Base after all. The children in our orphanage will rely on you to take care of them in the future. They are all fatherless children and are very naughty. If they can pass the training of 11 Base and become the pillars of the future, it will be really a good thing. Nanheng ignored the director's politeness. The quadrennial screening of 11 Base was just a routine. Usually only 1/10 of the people could be selected by 11 Base for training, and sometimes even less than 1/10. After all, not everyone had the ability to pass the tests and checkpoints set up by 11 Base. To become a member of 11 Base, one had to be fully qualified in both physical and mental quality and physical quality. When the rumored eldest son of the Li family, Li Nanheng, walked in and completely appeared in everyone's sight, the female teacher who had been teaching the children in the orphanage for many years was instantly stunned. His eyebrows were sharp, his eyes were deep, his nose was high, and his thin lips were slightly pursed. Was this man painted? As early as an hour ago, almost everyone in the orphanage, from the director to the cleaners, gathered in front of the door, waiting for the legendary eldest son of the Li family, Li Nanheng, to appear. The Li clan had great achievements and accomplishments in assisting the military affairs of both China and the United States. On the surface, they were mainly doing business, but in reality they had the world's largest training base in the dark, providing elite talents to the two countries' militaries. The Li family also had an extraordinary position in the United Nations Department. They kept a low profile because they controlled more than half of the military administration in the United States, and the Los Angeles police and other police forces in the United States could be deployed by them at any time. The so-called Li family, in more than half of the legal areas in the United States, could even shake the coastline 10,000 meters away with a casual stomp of their feet. Li Nanheng grew up in 11 Base. As the eldest son of the Li family and the person in charge of 11 Base, he was mysterious. Now that he suddenly appeared here, everyone in the orphanage was trembling. It was said that this man came in person and had a bad temper. Several well-dressed boys surrounded the tall and thin boy in the orphanage cafeteria. Feng Ling narrowed her eyes, and the surrounding temperature suddenly froze to the extreme. With a clatter, the meal Feng Ling had just fetched was snatched by one of them and fell to the ground, spilling soup and food all over the floor. Someone even kicked the chair behind Feng Ling away and looked at him with a gloomy face. "Brat, you've only been in the orphanage for a year. Do you really think you're a young master? You can only pretend to be deaf and dumb when we talk to you, right? I really don't want to stay in the orphanage with people like you for another second. When we are selected into 11 Base, you can continue to stay in this damn place and wait for death. Anyway, Director Lin always treats you as a deaf and mute, and even your name is not on the selection list of the base. Tut, what a useless waste. 11 Base?" Feng Ling's eyes were cold, but she remained calm. When she was working for the mafia, she did hear of 11 Base. It was said that it was a place related to the military training of the National Defense Forces and had a deep connection with the American police. It was a mysterious place that was very difficult to provoke, and it was a place that made many underground mafia in the United States tremble with fear. However, the base had nothing to do with her. She hated people who were too arrogant in front of her. "If you don't want to stay, get out of here. Do you have to bark in front of me? Or do you want to be selected into that base with a swollen face?" Feng Ling's expression was very indifferent, and her voice was as careless as her expression. "Get out of my sight in 3 seconds. Brat! How dare you be so arrogant? Tsk, your origin is unknown, but your name is very nice. You're called something Feng, something Ling. I heard that there's a very famous Chinese family in the United States with the surname Feng. That's a good family that you won't be able to get into. Who gave you the courage to give yourself such a name?" When Feng Ling was taken out of the wolf's cave at the age of 5, she had been wearing a jade plate engraved with the word Feng on her neck. At that time, there were several Chinese in that group who could read Chinese characters, so they directly took the word Feng as her surname. Since then, she has been called Feng Ling. Feng Ling ignored the provocation of these boys and was about to turn around when she suddenly heard one of them reach out to hold her down. Her eyes flickered. This morning, when the doctor gave her a sedative, he was probably still asleep and pulled out the needle halfway. Feng Ling, who had long developed a resistance to this kind of sedative because she had been taking sedatives for a long time, was not as weak as usual. She buckled her shoulder with one hand and easily turned her wrist. Suddenly, there was a cracked sound of wrist dislocation, followed by a scream. "His hand is disabled?" Feng Ling turned back lazily, still casually glancing back at the boy who was holding his wrist in pain and twitching all over. At the same time, she coldly glanced at the others. "Brat, how dare you hit me?" The man whose wrist was dislocated instantly roared in anger. His face was twisted in pain and he shouted, "Hold him down. Take off his clothes. Throw him into the yard for those girls to see. I want to King see how much guts he has." Not only did Feng Ling not panic because of his words, but those people also did not expect that he actually had some skills. After all, in the past year, Feng Ling had always been alone. No one knew what his real situation was. They only knew that he had a cold temper and was not to be trifled with. Unexpectedly, as soon as the group of people pounced forward, they did not see Feng Ling make any obvious movements. She only raised her hand casually, but with a carefree and unrestrained fierceness. The empty bowl on the table next to her, which someone had just finished eating, with a pah sound, passed through the crowd, and smashed hard against the boy's forehead. Ah! The person who was hit raised his dislocated hand, covered his instantly bloody forehead in pain, and fell to the ground. They did not expect Feng Ling to have such skills. Those boys who were about the same age as her, about 13 or 14 years old, instantly froze, not knowing whether to hit her or not. And at this moment Feng Ling kicked the lower body of one of them. Immediately another scream sounded. When they reacted, Feng Ling had nimbly flashed out of the encirclement of these people. She expressionlessly picked up the plate on the ground and turned to continue to get food. Damn this brat. Forget it, just wait. Sooner or later someone will deal with him. Feng Ling acted as if she did not hear it. She put the food on a new plate, walked to a clean table not far away and sat down without looking back. Chapter 740. Hearing this, Feng Ling casually picked up the disposable chopsticks of average quality and turned to look at him. Whether I can be killed or not is a matter for the future. But if you say one more word, I don't mind sending you to hell right now. The boy with blood all over his head. Damn, this Feng Ling had only been in the orphanage for more than a year. He had never contacted anyone. Today was the first time he had seen him fight. She didn't expect him to be so powerful. At night. This was the largest orphanage in Los Angeles, and there were a lot of adopted children. The people of 11 Base arrived at the orphanage in the afternoon. There were a lot of children on the list. They needed to stay here for one night and continue the screening tomorrow. Feng Ling fell asleep on time. After all, she had nothing else to do. However, she suddenly heard the sound of someone walking outside the window. It was rustling and she knew that the other party was very sneaky and not very aboveboard. It was just an orphanage. How could a thief sneak in? Feng Ling opened her eyes, sat up from the hard bed, looked at the figure flashing by outside the window, got up and walked out. However, when she walked towards the courtyard behind the orphanage, which was specially used to receive adoptive parents and guests, she suddenly saw the boys in the cafeteria during dinner and heard their cursing from a distance. Where did that surnamed Feng come from? He was so ruthless. My head still hurts. Just when they were still cursing, one of them suddenly keenly noticed the movement. The moment he turned to look at Feng Ling, who was walking slowly in the dark, their faces changed in an instant. What are you doing here? Feng Ling didn't answer. The movement she heard just now was definitely coming in this direction, but that person had obviously hidden himself. She just glanced at the bushes around expressionlessly. We have already warned you that after the candidates of our 11 base leave, you can only wait for death. What? You know you are not on the list of this screening, so you come out in the middle of the night to ask Boss Lee for a place? Let me tell you, stay away from Boss Lee. Otherwise you won't even know how you die. Seeing that Feng Ling still didn't seem to hear their words and didn't pay attention to them, the boy whose wrist had been twisted by Feng Ling and whose forehead was wrapped with a circle of gauze said angrily, "Damn, he is so arrogant. I don't believe he dares to fight against us with the people of 11 Base nearby. Drag him into the water behind us. Today we should let him know that this is not a place where he can continue to be arrogant." There were twice as many people gathered here tonight as in the cafeteria. There were about a dozen in total. The group of people instantly felt that Feng Ling was going to be unlucky this time. However, just as the dozen or so people stood up and rushed toward her, Feng Ling raised her leg and kicked the fastest person to the ground. In an instant, she grabbed the second person's neck and turned her hand. With a beautiful backhand, she pressed the person under her legs, raised her leg and stepped hard on his back. She bent one knee and stepped on the person. At the same time, she looked coldly at the others who were slow and hesitant. Go ahead if you want to die. The person who was kicked to the ground first felt pain in his internal organs. He raised his eyes in disbelief and wanted to curse but couldn't. He felt that as soon as he opened his mouth, he would spit out blood. Just as the third person was hesitantly about to pounce on her from behind, Feng Ling casually glanced back. When that person saw that she had discovered him, he immediately rushed forward angrily. However, at the moment he rushed over, Feng Ling calmly dodged him. There was no need for her to move at all. The trash in front of her directly pounced on the person she had just stepped on. The two people staggered and fell heavily to the ground at the same time. One of them even hit his head on the stone, instantly joining the group of people with broken heads and bleeding heads. Seeing that Feng Ling didn't seem to be struggling at all, as if even if a dozen of them rushed up at the same time, they would be trampled under her feet at any time, most of the remaining people had seen her in the canteen, so they didn't dare to step forward again. After hesitating for a long time, they took a few steps back. If you're not blind, you should be able to see that I have a bad temper. Don't provoke me. Otherwise, I don't mind crippling you here tonight. However, now that you're injured like this, I'm afraid you're not even qualified to be selected by 11 base. Feng Ling coldly opened her pale lips and said emotionlessly. After saying this, she continued to walk in the direction of the back courtyard as if nothing had happened, completely ignoring the dozen or so boys who were stunned on the spot and continuing to focus on the person hiding in the dark. Just after Feng Ling left, on the second floor of the guest room not far away, 2 members of 11 base stood there and talked. This boy is good at martial arts, and his aptitude is much better than this group of good-for-nothings. The other man leaned against the window, glanced at the figure that Feng Ling was chasing forward, and said meaningfully, "Someone broke in. He should be planning to directly attack Boss Lee. This boy seems to have noticed that someone is coming and has the courage to chase after him alone. Now we are outside the base. It's not surprising that someone is not afraid of death and wants to take the opportunity to make trouble. Boss has always been very vigilant. We don't need to take action at all. Let's just wait and see." Just as the man finished speaking, the 2 men turned their eyes and saw that Feng Ling was following the figure in the dark to the sauna room behind. Gee, their Boss Lee liked to take a bath in the sauna room at night. Although the sauna room in this orphanage was shabby, he didn't miss it. Now he was taking a bath in it. If 2 people sneaked in at this time, they didn't know what would happen inside. Where did he go? Feng Ling chased all the way here and saw that in front of her was the simple sauna room set up in the orphanage. The surroundings were all wooden structures and there seemed to be lights inside. Logically speaking, it was impossible for that person to sneak in. After all, the angle of the door and the angle of the window made it impossible for him to get in, but in the blink of an eye, he disappeared. Turning to look at a towering tree beside the wooden sauna room, she quickly climbed up the tree, and then quickly stepped on the roof. When she suddenly saw that the man had escaped to the eaves not far away, she immediately rushed over with a cold face and was about to follow him. However, the moment she turned around, she heard the sound of the wooden planks on the roof breaking. She didn't know whether the roof had been trampled by the man just now or because it had been in disrepair for a long time. With a kacha sound, Feng Ling fell from between the 3 wooden boards. Her hand was about to grab the edge of the board, but the wooden board on the edge also cracked. In less than half a second, Feng Ling's body suddenly fell down weightlessly and fell into a pool of hot water with a thud. Then she abruptly popped her head out of the water and suddenly met a pair of cold black eyes in the mist. Chapter 741. In the misty air, Feng Ling couldn't see his face clearly and could only see a trace of coldness in his dark eyes. She never expected that the wooden sauna room of the orphanage had been in disrepair for so many years that the roof was broken, and she didn't expect that the person below was actually taking a bath. The man who was taking a bath in the huge wooden tub in the sauna room had soaked for a long time, and his healthy, wheat-colored skin looked a little pale. When he looked at the boy who only had half his head exposed in the water through the steam, his lazy and cold aura made people instinctively feel danger. "What? Do you want to take a bath together?" Feng Ling wanted to say that she was not interested, but at this moment she came here to chase the person who was lurking in the dark. She couldn't explain herself if she fell down like this. At first glance, she knew that the man in front of her was not a good person. There had never been such a person in the orphanage, so this man should be from 11 base, but she didn't know what kind of position he had in 11 base. She still calmly submerged half of her face in the water, and the short hair on her head almost covered half of her face because of the water. She could only vaguely see a pair of indifferent and cold eyes through the wet hair. Seeing that she didn't move, Nan Heng still sat calmly in the bathtub, his muscular arms casually resting on the edge of the bathtub, and his long and narrow black eyes narrowed. He saw the vigilance and the idea of escaping gradually blossoming in her eyes. The man raised the corner of his mouth coldly. At the moment when she suddenly emerged from the water, he instantly grabbed one of her wrists and backhandedly pulled her back. Nan Heng's speed was so fast that Feng Ling almost couldn't dodge. She had been controlled by tranquilizers here for a whole year and hadn't fought with anyone for a long time. In the blink of an eye, Feng Ling changed from underestimating the enemy to resisting in the next second. She pulled her wrist out of the man's hand as fast as a nimble snake. It was so smooth because both of them had water on them, and there was some special bath lotion in the water, so it was much smoother than usual. Nan Heng didn't see the boy's back until she turned around and was about to run. Judging from his figure and back, he was just a child in his teens. The enemy definitely didn't send him here, but how could there be such a child in this orphanage? When he was about to chase after him, He didn't put on his clothes because he was taking a bath. Instead, he pulled off a bath towel and quickly wrapped it around his lower body. Then, he leaped forward and grabbed the teenager's shoulder when the teenager was about to run out of the sauna room. However, when he was about to turn the teenager around to see the teenager's face, the teenager, who had his back to him, quickly pulled off the bath towel and covered the teenager's head with it when he caught a glimpse of the teenager's white lower body. Nanheng couldn't see his face clearly. At the same time, his lower body felt cold, and the towel on his head almost covered him. He raised his hand coldly and waved, and the towel instantly flew to the other side like a living thing. It wrapped itself into a messy ball, smashed heavily on the wall and then fell to the ground. Feng Ling's movements were still very fast. At the moment when her face was about to be seen clearly, she knew that she probably couldn't escape from the main door. She turned around and rushed back to the bathtub, intending to jump out of the hole on it. At the moment when the person behind her was about to catch her, she reached into the bathtub, scooped up the water and splashed it hard on his face. Nanheng once again raised his hand to block, but just as the other party was about to take the opportunity to step on the edge of the bathtub and jump up, he instantly rushed forward like an agile cheetah, grabbed her left sleeve and fiercely pulled her down. In the end, there was only the sound of cloth tearing. Feng Ling's long-sleeved clothes were torn from the shoulder down, revealing most of the white skin below the shoulder. Both of them paused. Feng Ling's expression turned cold, but Nanheng paused for a moment. His cold brows instantly raised with some interest. Even if he only saw it for a moment, he could clearly see the porcelain white skin and the half of the undeveloped soft and round half that was faintly discernible under the torn clothes. Even if he was still a teenager, the already developed part was too clear a sign of his gender. Female? The moment this thought flashed through his mind, he pulled another hanging bath towel to cover his lower body. Feng Ling's expression was ugly as she swept her leg across the water. She was so angry that she almost flipped the entire bathtub over, causing more than half of the water inside to splash out. All of it was splashed toward Nanheng, who had temporarily stopped because he had discovered her gender. Taking advantage of the 2 seconds when his eyes were smeared with the bath liquid and instinctively closed his eyes, she pulled a towel by the side and wrapped it around her head to cover her face. When she turned around to attack him, her attacks were even fiercer, as though filled with killing intent. Nanheng only closed his eyes for 2 seconds. When he opened his eyes again, he saw the young man's initial attempt to dodge and escape to instantly attack him with murderous intent. The corners of his lips curled up indifferently, and he dodged without leaving a trace. He raised his hand and took the opportunity to pull off the young man's torn sleeve. In an instant, Feng Ling's entire arm was exposed. Her chest that had previously been faintly discernible, as well as her slender waist, were all presented in front of the man's eyes. He spoke unhurriedly. "Are you angry from embarrassment? Not bad at such a young age, and you're even a girl? How did you sneak in?" Feng Ling was enraged. She turned to the side and kicked the wall with one leg, borrowing the force to kick him again. After Nanheng noticed her age and that she was a girl, he did not attack again. Under her furious attacks, he only moved very casually to defend himself. He pushed her leg away with one hand, then backhanded her and was kicked away by her. He did not have the slightest intention of fighting seriously. It was as though he was casually teasing a teenage girl. Feng Ling had seen all kinds of bloody storms since she was young, but she had never been teased by a man. She was so angry that she wanted to kill him instantly. However, she could clearly feel that he was very agile. If he really wanted to fight seriously, she was afraid that she would not be his match. At the same time, from the corner of her eye, she saw the clothes of the man placed not far away. It seemed like he had a gun. People with guns were more difficult to deal with. Chapter 742. Nanheng frowned in pain and was about to make a move. However, this time, Feng Ling did not intend to be entangled with him. She quickly dodged his palm and leaped onto the edge of the bathtub. With the help of the wall of the wooden house that was not too high, she stepped on it and jumped out nimbly. Seeing that she had escaped, Nanheng didn't look shocked but just coldly narrowed his eyes at the cracked hole in the sauna room. A girl who could have such skills in this orphanage was definitely not ordinary. He had planned to test her background and then figure out her purpose, but it turned out that her ultimate goal was obviously not him. Otherwise she would not have escaped so easily. He's just a teenager. What was her identity? Nanheng slowly withdrew his cold and indifferent gaze and glanced at the sleeve thrown on the ground. The next day the broadcast in the orphanage rang. The voice was obviously from Director Lin himself. He summoned all the children in the orphanage to the empty field in front of him. No matter men or women, they must all be present. After the broadcast, the director turned back and respectfully looked at Nanheng, who looked calm. Mr. Lee, these children will arrive soon. We thought that you would select them from the list provided by the orphanage, but we didn't expect that Mr. Lee, despite being so busy, didn't intend to leave any child with potential behind and planned to meet each and every one of them. This is really a great blessing for them. Nanheng was indifferent and silent. He just stood on the second floor in front of the field and held the railing. The view here was the best and clearest. He looked at the teenagers who gradually appeared in the empty field, half male and half female. Before the headmaster could finish his words of flattery, the children below shouted excitedly when they saw the people above them. Li Nanheng, they actually saw the legendary young Master Li of 11 base. The Li family was powerful in the military and had the most mysterious and desirable 11 base in their hands. The whereabouts of young Master Li had always been a mystery and an unattainable existence. But now the legendary young Master Li was standing on the second floor of the stadium in front of their orphanage. He was even looking at them. The children were so excited, as if they would be selected to join 11 base in the next second. 11 base was directly connected to the US military and police. As long as they could become a member of 11 base, they would never have to worry about food and clothing in the future, and they might even have the opportunity to obtain military exploits, whether in the military or in politics. This was not an opportunity that ordinary people could get. If he could do well in 11 base, it would be an opportunity to reach the sky in a single bound. All the children in the orphanage had arrived. More than 100 children, ranging from 5 to 18 years old, were present. The director called the names one by one, and the children who were called would stand up and respond. However, after spending more than an hour, the 100 or so children had all appeared, but the one Nanheng was looking for was nowhere to be seen. He was sure that the teenager from last night was from the orphanage because the sleeve that was torn off was the uniform that every child in the orphanage had to wear. It was a black long-sleeved uniform similar to the school uniform, and the name and logo of the orphanage were on the cuffs. But she was not among the more than 100 children. Nanheng's eyes swept over the faces of the children one by one, and he said lightly, "Are you sure they are all here?" "Yes, they are all here. Our orphanage is the largest orphanage run by Chinese people in Los Angeles. At present, there are a total of 127 unadopted children under the age of 18, and all of them are here." The director echoed with a smile. "But 11 base never accepts girls, right? Why did you suddenly ask for girls to come out today, Mr. Lee?" Nanheng didn't answer but just looked at the faces that were looking in this direction and the uniform these children were wearing. 127, not a single one was missing. Seeing young Master Lee's cold eyes looking at the faces and figures of those children, not knowing what he was looking at or waiting for, the director and other teachers and people in charge of the orphanage all stood aside, not daring to ask a word. The crowd in the venue had gradually become excited. Everyone who was stared at by young Master Lee's eyes, whether they were men or women, was full of surprise, and they always felt that happiness was about to come to them. Only Feng Ling, who was sent to the orphanage by the police a year ago, was not included in the list of orphans because of special circumstances. Later, no matter in the group knowledge class or other aspects, everyone only knew that she was here, but they didn't specifically add her name to the list. As a result, when everyone was summoned today, they were so excited that they forgot that there was such a special person in the orphanage. They only checked the number of people in the orphanage and forgot the person who was locked in the dark little room. It was true that Feng Ling usually didn't communicate with others. After being injected with a tranquilizer in the morning, she went to the canteen to eat when she had the strength, and when she had no strength, she waited for the doctor to bring her food. Unless it was necessary, she never appeared in front of others or contacted others, so it was easy to be forgotten. And on such an occasion, even if he accidentally thought of her, he didn't intend to let her appear. Feng Ling was an uncontrollable and bad-tempered boy. If that boy accidentally provoked Li Nanheng, it would be a big trouble for the orphanage. She must not come. However, for some reason, young Master Li's temper was unpredictable. He was usually low-key and mysterious, and now they couldn't figure out what he was thinking. However, Li Nanheng's cold eyes made the president and the others panic. What made them even more nervous was that when young Master Li looked at them, they couldn't tell whether he was indifferent or indifferent. His king-like cold aura made those who were excited at the beginning gradually calm down, and they didn't even dare to breathe. And on the other side, Feng Ling lay on the bed in her dark room, her eyes slightly open, looking at the dim ceiling in a familiar daze. After coming back last night, she simply washed up, changed her clothes and lay down to sleep. Although she was still half awake at night, the person hiding in the corner didn't appear again. It wasn't until dawn that she fell asleep completely. After falling asleep, a doctor came in on time to give her a tranquilizer. The doctor's movement and the smell of disinfectant on him were very familiar. After a year of contact, Feng Ling instinctively continued to sleep, completely ignoring the doctor. Anyway, they had thousands of ways to inject the tranquilizer into her, and she had long been too lazy to resist. Chapter 743. When it was almost noon, Feng Ling gradually recovered her strength and sat up from the bed. When she was in the hands of the mafia, she was still young. Even if her body had gone through the normal development stage, she didn't pay much attention to the changes in her figure. This year, she rarely contacted others, and she was also used to wearing loose clothes, so she didn't pay much attention to it. What happened last night made Feng Ling more vigilant. She got up and looked around the room, finally finding a soft dress that she hadn't worn for a long time, and then dug out a dagger she had hidden under the mattress for a long time. She cut the clothes into a continuous strip of about 4 or 5 centimeters wide, then took off her clothes, stood in front of the mirror, and wrapped the strip around her body as a chest wrapping cloth. She didn't put on her clothes again until she was sure that the outline of her body was no longer obvious because of the chest wrapping cloth. The boy in the mirror looked a little stronger than usual because of the chest wrapping cloth, and his back didn't look so thin. She glanced at a clear red mark extending from the back of her ear to her collarbone, and a trace of displeasure appeared in her eyes. Last night, the man in the sauna room only defended and didn't attack, but he was fast and accurate in the early stage and almost caught her neck several times. If he hadn't intended to do anything to her, she probably wouldn't have been able to escape last night. Seeing the red mark left by the man's attack, Feng Ling raised her lips coldly and covered the mark. At the same time, there seemed to be a lot of footsteps approaching outside. Standing in front of the mirror, Feng Ling paused and turned to look at the closed door. Outside the door, Nan Heng casually glanced at the short and shabby old building behind the orphanage. Dean Lin hurriedly said, "This is the first building built when the orphanage was just established more than 30 years ago. It has been 30 years and looks a little shabby. There used to be a lot of children living here, but now the children have moved into the new building. It's just used to pile up some sundries. It's dirty and messy inside, so no one usually comes here." Nan Heng's eyes fell on the doors under the old building and saw that the bluestone paths outside the other doors were covered with moss. It was true that no one had entered for a long time, but there was no moss on the path closest to the main road here. Obviously, there were people walking there every day. He only glanced at the door and stopped in his tracks. The dean was slightly startled. Did young Masterly find something? He had never regretted so much that he agreed to let the police send Feng Ling to the orphanage. Although if Feng Ling didn't make trouble, even if young Masterly found out, he had promised in the morning that all the children had arrived. If young Masterly misunderstood that they deliberately hid someone, it would be a big misunderstanding. Suddenly, everyone saw Nan Heng's footsteps approaching the door. There was no extra expression on his noble and handsome face, but there was only a sense of uneasiness. Feng Ling was already standing in the door. She vaguely heard footsteps approaching, and they were only separated by a door. Nan Heng stood outside the door, leaned over, and looked at the bare bluestone path in front of the door. His cold voice was not clear whether he was talking to the people in the door or the people behind him. "Is this the storeroom? How long has it been since anyone went in? Isn't this kind of place the most likely to give birth to all kinds of insects and unknown microorganisms? If something that you don't even know lives in there, don't scare those children." "No, young Masterly, you're really funny. Occasionally there are people in charge of the orphanage who go in to clean and tidy up, but we don't go in often. After all, there is too much dust inside. Dust is not a big deal. If the orphanage is understaffed, I don't mind asking my men to go in and tidy up for you. If there is something that shouldn't exist in there, it will be convenient to kill it." He said lightly, and his voice was so low and cold that only Feng Ling could hear the warning in his words. Feng Ling's face was cold and calm. It was not certain who would kill who. She put the dagger that she had just taken out from under the bed into her clothes with one hand and silently pressed the door with the other, ready to fight at any time. However, in this orphanage her hostility had been greatly reduced. If the people outside the door didn't directly attack, she wouldn't rush out to make trouble. Listening to the voice of the man outside and the conversation between him and the director just now, it was not difficult to infer that the man in the sauna room last night was the legendary Li Nanheng of 11 Base. The director said a few more words outside, trying to explain how dirty and messy the sundries here were and that they might fall down and hurt people at any time. Even if there were some things, they might be mice and cockroaches. There was no need for the people of 11 Base to make such a big deal out of it for fear that they would be killed. It was better to ask the people in the orphanage to clean it up themselves. Through the door, Nanheng couldn't hear any movement inside, but with his experience, it was not difficult for him to hear that someone was standing in the door with his breath closed. Last night he had seen the skills of the boy with his own eyes. The most basic means of self-protection, such as holding one's breath, should be very easy for him. As if because of the director's inexplicable explanation, Nanheng suddenly smiled, but his eyes were indifferent as if he was going to directly punch a hole in the door. I haven't seen cockroaches and mice for many years. It's a pity that I can't see them. The director kept saying that he didn't want to dirty young Master Li's eyes, and then took the opportunity to ask others to point in another direction and invite young Master Li to visit. Feng Ling still held her breath inside the door. The person outside was silent for a moment and didn't say a word. She leaned against the door and heard the footsteps gradually fading away. Feng Ling turned around and looked out through the gap in the window next to her. When she saw the tall but seemingly dangerous back, she slowly loosened her hand that had been holding the dagger in her clothes. The man didn't look as he did last night when he was naked in the sauna room with a faint smile on his perfect upper body. The sunlight fell on his body and seemed to be plated with a layer of unreal golden light. The man's back was noble and cold. Just when Feng Ling was about to withdraw her gaze, he suddenly stopped and glanced back out of the corner of his eyes. She didn't know if he felt her gaze or something else, but he suddenly stopped and glanced back out of the corner of his eyes. Through the hidden gap in the window, Feng Ling instantly felt the man's gaze, which seemed to be full of coldness. She then looked at the group of 11 base subordinates and bodyguards in black suits behind him and instinctively felt that she had inadvertently provoked a big trouble. Chapter 744. The leaders and the director of the orphanage all breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, young Master Li didn't insist on going in. Otherwise, if Feng Ling did anything disrespectful inside, everyone would suffer with him. It was a false alarm. Only one leader turned around and walked back. He abruptly pushed open the door of Feng Ling's room and saw the slender and thin boy standing in front of the window. He frowned and said unhappily, "It seems that the amount of tranquilizers should be increased in the future. I shouldn't have left such a scourge like you in the orphanage. You are unsociable, indifferent, and don't get along well with others. People like you can't even survive in a place like the orphanage. I think you can only sit here and wait to die. You might as well go back to your wolf cave and continue to be an animal." After speaking as if he had vented out all the panic he had felt just now, the hospital leader slammed the door angrily, turned around and left. In the room, Feng Ling coldly looked out of the window at the person walking away. She raised her hand and glanced at the small red needle mark that would appear on her arm every day, and the corners of her mouth curled up coldly. Increase the amount of tranquilizers? She had endured it for a year. Did he really think she would be locked up here like a prisoner for the rest of her life? A year was enough for her body to develop natural antibodies to these tranquilizers, and she would gradually recover her strength every afternoon. As long as she wanted to leave, no one could stop her. Her hand paused slightly in her clothes and she hid the dagger in her clothes again. At the same time, Feng Ling glanced at the sky outside the window, and the indifferent smile on her lips deepened. At night, the advanced military Hummer reflected a layer of cold light in the cold moonlight. After the screening of the orphanage, only 3 or 4 people passed the screening and could be taken back by the people of 11 Base for training. The training period was 2 months. If their physical fitness was not up to standard within 2 months, they would still be returned to the orphanage and would never be selected again. Seeing the cold and smooth Hummer leave in the night, the nervous mood of the group of people in the orphanage finally relaxed. At this moment, on the other side of the orphanage, a black figure nimbly flashed past, avoiding all the security guards and surveillance cameras in the orphanage. Since the security guards outside the wall were also at the main entrance today, it was rare for them to be negligent in their defense. He directly flipped over the wall and easily cut the wires of the anti-theft net on the top of the wall. After the power was cut, there was no current in the anti-theft net, so he could climb through it with his bare hands. When the figure successfully climbed over the high wall of the orphanage and quietly walked out in the darkness, everyone thought that the Hummer Li Nanheng was in had sped away, but the Hummer following him stopped a moment ago. "Boss, we found him. He's over there." The driver caught a glimpse of a figure jumping out from the wall of the orphanage. Li Nanheng opened his thin lips slightly and said indifferently, "Keep an eye on him. It seems like he's just trying to escape. He's currently heading towards the main road." The anti-theft net on the walls of the orphanage has a strong electric current. Ordinary people can't get through it at all. This kid doesn't look old, but he's pretty good. He managed to get out safely without being discovered by the people inside. Nanheng didn't stop. He glanced at the direction where the boy escaped and signaled the driver to follow him with his eyes. The black Hummer had been lurking in the night for a long time. In an instant it caught up with him, followed by the cars of several bodyguards. The people in the orphanage didn't know what had happened. 10 minutes later, there was a sudden exclamation from the security room of the orphanage. What happened? The anti-theft net has been destroyed. In the distance, Feng Ling walked on foot. Hearing the sound of the car behind her, she had long guessed that Li Nanheng wouldn't let her go easily. She connected the wires she had just removed from the anti-theft net with the 2 batteries she had secretly carried in her arms. At the moment when the wires were connected at a certain angle, she suddenly threw the wires into the lawn and bushes behind her. In an instant, the wires fell among the flammable bushes. Sparks flew and there was the sound of electric current. Then there was a sudden burst of flames and crackling noises, causing the black Hummer to stop abruptly before it was about to run over the bushes. Feng Ling took the opportunity to leave through a small road that no cars could pass through. She fled in the opposite direction of the other party's guess. Nanheng got out of the car, and his slender figure walked to the side of the bushes that were instantly ignited. He stood with one hand in his trouser pocket, wearing a black suit jacket that he didn't put on. He raised his cold black eyes to look at the figure that was quickly escaping, and a glimmer of interest appeared in his deep black eyes. The people in the car also rushed down, put out the fire in the bushes, and then sent people to continue to chase. However, half an hour later they all returned without success. They didn't expect that as the training team of 11 base, they had a 0 failure record in all kinds of tasks, but they were tricked by a teenager and couldn't even catch up with him. How was it possible? Who on earth was that boy? Boss. A few of his men walked back with ugly expressions. That kid's whereabouts are very strange. We've checked all the roads in front of us, but there's no trace of him. The remaining road is a dead end. In the distance is a high mountain jungle. There are wild tigers, wolves, jackals, and other beasts that can eat people alive at any time. The U.S. has never destroyed these natural jungles, nor will they send people in easily. It's full of danger. If that kid ran into that place, I'm afraid he won't be able to survive. Couldn't survive? Nanheng's sharp black eyes glanced in the direction of the jungle, and then glanced at the burnt wires that his men found in the bushes. That was obviously a ruthless little she-wolf. Any wire or battery could give her a chance to escape. Since she dared to break into the jungle, she must have the ability to survive. At this moment of escape, would you think of taking off the wires of the anti-theft net to protect yourself? As Nanheng said, his black military boots fiercely crushed the charred battery fluid on the ground. He looked down at the wires thrown on the ground, the bushes and the jungle in the distance, and his face was cold like the god of darkness. This kind of person at such a young age has such a sharp and decisive mind and skills. We can't let him go easily. If I can find him, he will either be used by me or killed by me. The men on the side looked solemn. For a moment, they couldn't resist the cold gaze in their boss's eyes. It seemed that the boss was already very dissatisfied that they failed to catch that boy. Chapter 745. Of course, wolves, tigers, and leopards in the jungle were no problem for Feng Ling. She grew up drinking wolf's milk, and the skills she learned to survive in the jungle caves before she was 5 years old were not for nothing. She could survive in front of a pack of wolves, and in the face of the great dangers in the jungle and the fighting between beasts, she had a perfect way to protect herself. Perhaps because she had drunk wolf's milk, she had a dangerous smell that only some animals could smell, so no one dared to approach her. It only took her 1/3 of the time of ordinary people to successfully escape from the other side of the jungle, and in case of being blocked outside, she simply swam away through the river in another direction. She finally got ashore and her clothes were soaked. She could only pile firewood by the river and bake herself for a while. These survival methods in the jungle were so simple that she could find some food and daily necessities by herself in a few minutes. She didn't have any consciousness of being alone in the dark and dangerous, let alone the slightest fear. But she probably couldn't sleep tonight. After all, the group of people who took her in had been arrested, and she had lived in the orphanage for a year. Now the outside world was still strange to her, and she still didn't know how to live like a normal person. Li Nanheng also couldn't fall asleep. The man sat in the tall black Hummer, the window rolled down, and outside was the starlight above the jungle that was more brilliant than in the city. Several men outside the car were still looking for the trace of the boy, and they even waited at the exit of the jungle where she should have chosen all night, but she didn't come out. The time of the people of 11 Base had always been precious. This time they went to the orphanage designated by the Lee family for business, but at this moment, they spent a lot of time here waiting for a teenage boy. Only Li Nanheng himself knew how precious the time they wasted was. His men walked to the side of the car and saw that boss was going to continue to wait and had no intention of leaving. Without young Master Li's permission, no one dared to stop looking for him. It was past 8 o'clock the next day, but there was not even a footprint on the road in the jungle that separated the jackals, wolves, tigers, and leopards. With one hand behind his back, Nanheng walked through the jungle expressionlessly. He glanced coldly at the higher bushes on the other side, which made it impossible to predict what was in the distance, then turned around and walked over. A few hundred meters behind the shrubs was a silent river. It wasn't very wide, but it was obviously very deep. What immediately attracted Nanheng's attention was a patch of grass on the other side of the river. There was a scorch mark there. Obviously, someone had been warming himself by the fire last night, but that person had already escaped once again. Nanheng took the unlit cigarette out of his mouth and looked coldly at the charred spot on the table across the river. He only said 2 words, "Very good." His voice was so cold that it made the underlings behind him shiver. They were all too clear about their boss's usual conduct and temper. It was most likely the first time that he, a proud son of heaven in the incomparably honorable Li clan, had been fooled by a stinking brat. Boss probably wanted to tear him apart right now. His men didn't even dare to breathe, silently praying for the brat who escaped from the orphanage, hoping that he wouldn't be caught by young Master Li in the future, or he would be killed directly. "Go back to the orphanage to investigate his situation," Nanheng said coldly. His men mistook the she as he. After all, except for Nanheng, no one could have guessed that such a nimble and agile boy was actually an incredibly fair-skinned girl. His men quickly rushed back to the orphanage, but the result of the investigation was that even the people in the orphanage didn't know who the boy was. When he went back to explain to young Master Li, his men coughed twice. The entire orphanage didn't know the specific situation of the boy. They only knew that he was a child rescued from the gangsters who were killed a year ago. He was used by the gangsters since he was a child and struggled to survive until he was a teenager. The police had some pity for him, so they sent him to the orphanage, but he never communicated with others and behaved in a way that made people wary of him. They were afraid that he would accidentally offend you, so they didn't let him show up with other children at the same time. Hearing this, Nanheng's eyes turned cold. The subordinate said again, "Boss, the mafia that this kid was attached to has nothing to do with us. I didn't participate in the police's operation, so I can't directly investigate his situation. I don't think he has any feelings for the mafia, but he is really good at martial arts. The key is that no matter what he does, he is very fast. It's really unexpected." Was more than fast. It could be said that he was fast, ruthless, and accurate. A young girl, but she had the sharp nature and decisive decision-making ability of a jackal. Nanheng sat quietly in the car, and the cigarette between his fingers was still not lit, but he seemed to be holding a bit of hostility between his fingers. It was rare for someone to escape under his nose. Then he got out of the car and looked down at the jungle in the distance as if he was stepping on this big half of Los Angeles. Pay attention to the movements in Los Angeles in the next few days. She broke out of the orphanage alone. It won't be easy for her to survive. Nanheng turned his head, and there was a cold light in his eyes. His men were stunned. Chapter 746. The sky brightened too quickly and the sky darkened too quickly. In the night, Los Angeles was full of music. Feng Ling could clearly feel that she was out of tune with this world. She wasn't hungry. Last night, she had roasted a few fish by the riverbank. Normally, she didn't eat much and could at least last a day. But now that she was walking on the streets of Los Angeles and looking at all kinds of people, she suddenly realized that the environment she grew up in was not the same as here. If she wanted to survive, she had to either return to the jungle or go back to a place where the way of life was not much different from the way she lived in the past few years, but she knew very well how vicious the mafia was. She used to live for food, to survive, and to not be beaten, but now, which way should she go? Half a year later. In the mountains west of Los Angeles, several explosions and gunshots overlapped, startling the birds in the bushes to fly away. In the past 6 months, Feng Ling was used to looking for food in the woods at night, finding a shelter to live in, and going to the city during the day to find her own way out. Even if she was tired of eating those fish and small animals, she had no concept of robbing them. She even had no concept of money. Even if she robbed them, she could only buy food and didn't know what else to do, so she might as well find her own food to eat. In the morning, hearing the gunshots outside, Feng Ling opened her eyes and looked at the smoke that could be vaguely seen in the air not far away. This place was far from downtown Los Angeles, and the mafia often liked to find such a place to escape. The police often chose this place for military exercises, but the smoke did not look like a simple exercise. Someone was really making trouble here. Feng Ling smelled the obvious smell of gunpowder and followed the smell, but when she saw the blood in the bushes in the woods, she slowed down and looked around for footprints and movements around. Walking deep ahead, she suddenly noticed something. She was about to dodge to the side, but her foot was suddenly held by a blood-stained hand. Her face turned cold, and she abruptly lowered her head to look at the young man who had fallen in the bushes and was covered in blood. She then looked coldly at the hand that was holding her ankle, and the murderous intent in her eyes was obvious. "Don't go over, it's dangerous ahead." However, the man lying on the ground covered in blood said in a hoarse and weak voice. The killing intent in Feng Ling's eyes gradually dissipated. She glanced at his seriously injured appearance and easily shook his hand off. She did not speak and was about to move forward. "There is a small bomb that was recently buried 100 meters away. Don't go over," the man said again, but his voice was very low because he was seriously injured and lost too much blood. Seeing the gun on his waist, she turned back and squatted down to take the gun. The young man, who was covered in blood, frowned and looked at her warily. He saw that she was young, but the temperature in her eyes was so cold that she seemed incompatible with this world. He frowned. "What are you doing?" "I will save you on the condition that you give this gun to me." Feng Ling's words were straightforward and cold. When the man frowned and was about to say something, she quickly picked up the gun at her waist and moved forward. Before the young man on the ground could see her steps clearly, she had jumped up the tree in the blink of an eye, avoided the bombs and mines lying in ambush on the ground, and rushed to the front smoothly. The young man was seriously injured, but the people of 11 Base had always had an established rule. As long as the gun was there, the person was there. 11 Base's bullets must not be used by any enemy or insignificant person. But he couldn't get up after a long time. About 10 minutes later, he vaguely heard a few gunshots and then there was silence. Then there was the rustling of leaves being rubbed by clothes. He slowly opened his eyes weakly and in a blur of blood, he saw the slender and thin teenager coming back. A pair of black boots stained with mud and blood stood in front of him. "Were you injured because you were ambushed?" Feng Ling asked. Seeing her come back, the man on the ground immediately answered, "Yes. Your gun is very useful. Give it to me." Feng Ling was not negotiating with him because she had already killed the lackeys who had set up the ambush. She thought this was the reward and price he should pay. The man on the ground also understood what she meant. Her request was not unreasonable, but 11 Base had its rules. He frowned and looked up at her again. "If you want my gun, that's fine, but our place has a rule. If you're not one of us, you can't use our guns. Otherwise, if I go back empty-handed, I'll be killed because I broke the rule. You've saved me, but you've also killed me." Feng Ling didn't quite understand his words, but she looked at the blood on his body and asked, "Can you still walk?" The man on the ground nodded. "I'm fine. I won't die. I just lost too much blood. I'll be fine after a few hours of rest." Feng Ling glanced at him coldly again. She didn't know the mark engraved under the butt of the gun in her hand, but only knew that this kind of gun was the most comfortable one she had ever seen in her life. For no reason, she was curious about the place this man mentioned. This big city was not suitable for her to live, and as a normal person she couldn't really go back to the jungle to live. She might as well go to the place he mentioned with the excuse of saving him. Feng Ling looked at the man on the ground and still asked in a flat tone, "What's your name?" "My name is Kay." The man on the ground swallowed the blood in his mouth, raised his head with some difficulty, looked at the cold-eyed boy and smiled at her gratefully. "What about you? What's your name?" "Feng Ling." When she was brought into 11 Base by Kay, Feng Ling felt that this place seemed to be a hidden military training base, but Kay took her into the base from the back road and the side, so she didn't see the sign of 11 Base at the front door. After she was officially taken in, she heard the conversation between Kay and the others and realized that this damn place turned out to be 11 Base under Li Nanheng's charge. She almost regretted it. She planned to leave directly, but Kay invited her to stay with a sincere look, saying that he would introduce her to their boss Li and kept praising her skills with the other bodyguards and brothers in front of the door. Many people were looking at her curiously. It was not difficult to see that these people were good at martial arts. She could escape with the moves she learned from childhood, but in front of so many people she had no chance of winning. And in a place like 11 Base, if she suddenly ran away for no reason, she might not be able to escape at all. Hey, our boss is back. At this time, Kay suddenly patted her on the arm. Feng Ling turned her head and looked in the direction Kay pointed, only to see that the tall black Hummers she had successfully avoided half a year ago were driving in this direction. Chapter 747. Enemies were bound to meet on a narrow road. This was probably it. At this moment, Feng Ling could only be glad that he didn't see her face in the sauna room, but this was obviously not an easy way to avoid the problem. Seeing that Li Nanheng's car had driven in, Kay took Feng Ling's wrist and was about to walk over, but as soon as his hand touched her wrist, he was abruptly flung away. Kay paused and looked back at her. Seeing Feng Ling's expressionless face, he smiled awkwardly. Sorry, I forgot that you don't like to be touched. In fact, Kay was only 18 years old, only 5 years older than Feng Ling, but he was still a bit hot-headed. Although Feng Ling was young, her character was calm, mature, and indifferent, making it hard for people to see through her. Feng Ling didn't speak but glanced coldly at the black Hummer over there and said indifferently, "Your base is not suitable for me. I don't want the gun. Keep it for yourself. I'll leave later." "Where are you going?" "Thank you for not only saving my life but also cleaning the wound on my back in the past 2 days. You are my great benefactor. Didn't you say you don't have a place to live outside? Since you are so good at martial arts, why don't you stay in our 11 base in the future?" As Kay spoke, he quietly leaned close to her ear and whispered to the cold-eyed boy, "Let me tell you, not everyone can enter our 11 base, but with your martial arts skills you can definitely enter. Besides, you have saved me. I just need to tell the drill master. Also, recently our boss has something to deal with at home and can't often stay in the base, so the drill master will be in charge of the recruitment for the time being. Although our boss is not easy to deal with, the drill master can handle it. Don't worry. He will definitely let you stay." Feng Ling, she didn't want to stay. But there were people with good martial arts skills around, so she stood there quietly and didn't speak. "Our boss has got off. Do you want to see him?" Kay asked. "No." It was a very cold word. His voice was so cold that Kay couldn't help but take another look at him. However, Feng Ling remained expressionless from beginning to end, making it impossible for anyone to see through her thoughts. Because the black Hummer had stopped, many brothers had gone over to say hello, but Feng Ling had no intention of approaching it. She turned to the back of the crowd, crossed her arms over her chest, looked silently at the car surrounded by people and thought for a while. 11 Base was indeed the most powerful military training base in the United States. It had connections with both the underworld and the underworld. No one dared to provoke it, and the drill masters and trainers here were said to be top-notch. This kind of place was obviously suitable for her. That was if they were willing to accept her. If Li Nanheng didn't notice that she was the one in the orphanage, she could stay. Besides, there were so many people in 11 Base. There were hundreds of people in the base, and there were also many people who had finished their military service and were working in various police stations in the United States. It seemed impossible for a high and mighty person like him to notice a small character like her. He chased her outside the orphanage because she accidentally saw him taking a bath. Not only that, but also that kind of naked. And because he found out that she was a woman. He probably couldn't bear it. The subsequent chase was probably because of his unwillingness and her provocation. There was no deep hatred or entanglement, so he didn't seem to have any need to pay attention to her. In the end, Feng Ling saw Kay standing in place and didn't go over, so she glanced at him. "Isn't that your boss? Why don't you go over?" "In fact, our boss is very cold and bad-tempered, but he has outstanding military exploits and no one in the whole base can beat him. Many brothers are particularly enthusiastic to him because of their admiration for him, but boss basically doesn't talk to them." Kay coughed and smiled awkwardly. "I wanted to go over and say hello, but after all, you are here and I brought you here, so I can't leave you alone. Besides, even if I go over now, I'm afraid that boss will only give me a cold look. My skills and ability haven't reached the level where boss will take me seriously, and I really can't expect to be seen by boss, so it's meaningless to force my way over." Feng Ling glanced at Kay. "You are actually good at martial arts, but you still need time." Kay immediately glanced at her. "How old are you? Do you think I need time? What about you?" Feng Ling coldly smiled. 13 years old, but I lived in the jungle from the age of 1, fought with birds and beasts, and learned how to protect myself. When I was 5 years old, I began to learn how to shoot. Do you have to discuss age with me?" "Kay, He entered 11 base at the age of 15 and had only received training for 3 years. No wonder the gap between them was so big. Not far away, when Nanheng got out of the car, the people around him were sensitive to the fact that the atmosphere around Boss seemed to have reached a freezing point. Many people knew that although Boss was the eldest son of the Li family, he didn't have much contact with his family. Recently he suddenly returned to the Li family. No one knew why and no one could guess. However, at this moment, looking at Boss's expression, they knew that the atmosphere and temperature in the base would probably be low for a while. At this moment, the man who had just gotten out of the car caught a glimpse of 2 figures in the distance from the corner of his eye. When he saw K, his face was expressionless, but he suddenly paused for a second and looked over again. The man who looked like an emperor suddenly tilted his head, and a faint light flashed across his deep eyes. Everyone turned to look in that direction as well. "Boss, you," the man raised his hand and motioned them to shut up. This gesture made the surrounding people quiet down in an instant. It should be known that Boss would only say a few words to the people in the base when they were strengthening their training. Many newcomers and semi-newcomers who were still in training could rarely get Boss's special attention. Even many senior members with outstanding military achievements might not have the opportunity to get too close to Boss. Boss, who seemed indifferent to everything, seemed to be attracted at this moment. Who was that person? Of course, Kay and the others recognized him, but the boy behind Kay looked young. His short black hair was soft and just reached the length of the back of his ears. Even when Li Nanheng's cold eyes met him, he was still lazy and indifferent without any superfluous reaction. This boy's figure looked very familiar from a distance. Chapter 748. Even when the man approached, Feng Ling still stood still and didn't look away. But Kay was shocked that Boss suddenly came over and his attention seemed to be on Feng Ling. He immediately said with a flattered or conflicted expression, "Boss?" Li Nanheng didn't respond. He just looked at Feng Ling and his eyes darkened. His thin lips curved coldly and he spat out a string of cold words. "When did the base become a sightseeing place for strangers? Who are you? Do you know where this place is?" Looking at the obvious inquiry in Li Nanheng's indifferent eyes, Feng Ling guessed that he should feel that her figure was familiar, but after all, he had never seen any part of her above the neck. Besides, she was wrapped in a chest cloth and looked a little stronger. He must be just suspicious but not sure. But from his eyes, for the first time in her life, Feng Ling had a feeling that her hair stood on end. Even when she was surrounded by the police and faced with dozens of guns a year and a half ago, she didn't have such an inexplicable feeling of guilt. If it weren't for the fact that she was wearing clothes and the chest cloth, she would have suspected that the boss of 11 Base had recognized her at a glance. But when she thought about it carefully, she realized that they had only met once in the sauna room, and they had been fighting all the time. The steam in the sauna room was so misty that she couldn't even see his naked lower body through the mist. How could he see her clearly? Besides, it had been half a year. But this man's keenness did make her feel very dangerous. Feng Ling smiled coldly. "It seems that next time I save people I should be more careful, lest I accidentally save people of 11 Base and be inexplicably labeled as tourists after being invited in." Hearing her words, Nanheng took a look at Kay next to him. Hearing her words, Nanheng took a look at Kay, who hurriedly nodded. "Yes, boss, little brother Feng Ling saved my life. I was ambushed at the foot of Mount Viros and almost died in those people's hands. Little brother Feng Ling saved my life. I saw that he was good at martial arts and his age was just right for the new recruits in the base this year. Besides, he had nowhere to go, so I let him follow me back to the base. I wanted to tell the drill master about it, but I didn't expect that boss would suddenly—" Kay saw that Nanheng's expression was so cold that it almost froze him to death. As he spoke, he didn't know what he had said wrong, but boss's expression was obviously not warm at all. Instead, it was so cold that it made people panic. 11 Base is famous. I'm really lucky to be able to stand here. She needed to find a way out for herself, but it could not be a dangerous way out. She also needed to find an opportunity. Nanheng looked at her with his deep eyes and did not speak immediately. Feng Ling was not in a hurry. Standing in front of him, her posture was even more standard than those members who had been trained in the base for a year. After about a few seconds, the man finally said coldly, "Being able to fight doesn't mean that you have martial arts skills, and having martial arts skills doesn't mean that you can stay in 11 Base. Since you are the savior of the base members, I'll give you this opportunity. Wait for me at the training ground tonight. Let's talk if you can survive 3 moves from me." His commanding tone didn't have the slightest bit of warmth, it was cold. Feng Ling raised her eyebrows slightly and did not say much, which meant that she accepted it, but Kay was as excited as if something was wrong. When Li Nanheng turned to leave expressionlessly, Feng Ling stood in the same place and curved her thin lips arrogantly. As expected, he was suspicious of her. First, he wanted to test her martial arts skills, see her moves, and then what? She had heard from a few Chinese people in the mafia that since she planned to stay in 11 base, she would take it one step at a time and try to stay as long as she could. The fact that she was a woman must continue to be covered up. Otherwise, there would be no woman left in this kind of place. Besides, the fact that she had seen Nanheng's naked body would probably be the reason for him to drive her out. In fact, she didn't see it clearly at that time. Feng Ling inexplicably felt that she had suffered a big loss. She didn't see anything clearly and was still being chased. Wasn't she wronged? Kay found a temporary place for Feng Ling, which was the bed in his room. The bed was divided into upper and lower bunks just like the normal training troops. The only difference was that many troops in China would have at least 8 people in a room, but here there were only 2 people in a room at most. The lower bunk of Kay's room was sent out on a mission last month and he was still in Africa, so Feng Ling could live here temporarily. It was getting dark. After answering the drill master's call, Kay walked out, leaving the room to Feng Ling alone. After making sure that he would not come back for the time being, Feng Ling locked the door, picked up the black combat suit that Kay had just given her, and went straight into the bathroom. It wouldn't be too late to take a shower before fighting. After taking a shower, Feng Ling changed into the black suit. Kay said that he had worn this combat suit when he first came to the base 3 years ago. At that time he was only 15 years old, but boys at this age grew too fast. In less than half a year, this suit became too small, so now it didn't look very old and was only a little bit bigger for her to wear. And this little bit bigger was great for Feng Ling. A slightly loose suit was suitable for hiding her figure. Before coming to 11 base, Kay gave her a sum of money to thank her, saying that her clothes were too old and wanted her to buy a few sets of clothes to wear, but Feng Ling didn't buy them. Instead, she bought a few pieces of cloth suitable for wrapping breasts and made them into more effective breast wrappings. Now she wrapped the breast wrappings around her body, which no longer felt stuffy and airless, and could be wrapped around a few more times to hide her figure better. On the other side, after returning to the base, Nanheng had a simple meeting with several drill masters in the base, and then stood in front of the window on the second floor behind the base. The subordinate who had just come in stood behind him, not daring to speak or disturb Boss, but his eyes still couldn't help looking at him. He didn't know why Boss was even more depressed than usual after returning from the Li family this time. Could it be that the elders of the Li family had done something shocking to anger Boss again? Although Boss was a godlike existence in the base, after all he was still a junior in the Li family. The elders of their family had all led soldiers to fight in wars and had great power in the military, but when they taught their children a lesson, they either swung a cane or directly whipped them with a belt. Tut tut, he didn't dare to imagine that scene. But what was going on with Boss today? Why did he keep looking in the direction of the training ground expressionlessly? Chapter 749. When it was getting dark, Nanheng had already gone to the training ground alone. Probably because he had nowhere to vent his anger after coming back from the Li family, he was worried that there was no one to beat, and probably wanted to see the true face of that boy. In short, in the eyes of many members of the base, Boss, who had never cared about anything, actually took the initiative to go to the training ground to test a newcomer. The point was that Boss was waiting for him. He's not here yet? Nanheng glanced at Kay who was passing by and asked. Kay paused. He didn't expect that Boss would take the initiative to ask him. He immediately stopped and replied, I just went to the drill master's place to get something. Feng Ling probably took a bath and changed his clothes because he was about to compete with you. Aha, life should have some sense of ceremony. I feel that he attaches great importance to you, but I think he should have finished packing up by now. However, no matter how Kay laughed, Feng Ling still didn't appear until the sky was completely dark. Nanheng, who had waited on the training ground for more than half an hour, looked as cold as frost. The group of base members around couldn't help sighing in their hearts. He actually dared to let Boss Li's brother go. Did he know how to write the word death? Although Nanheng looked angry, he had nothing else to do tonight, so he was not in a hurry. He randomly picked a few members to fight, but after a few rounds they all fell to the ground crying and begging for mercy. Usually the drill master wouldn't beat these people too hard. After all, many of them had just joined the base and needed more actual combat training and basic training. It would take them at least 5 or 8 years to pass the training. But Nanheng obviously didn't intend to show mercy. When these young members were called to the training ground, they knew this would happen, but they didn't expect that in the end, they really fell to the ground and couldn't get up. Looking at these useless newcomers, Nan Heng was expressionless and didn't fight anymore. He just glanced at the darkening sky. Boss, was he still going to wait for that boy so late at night? Who on earth was that boy? The group of people couldn't help looking at Kay. Kay was also dumbfounded. Finally, in the darkness of the night, a slender black figure came over under the cold moonlight. When she walked to the training ground, Feng Ling glanced at the newcomers who were scrambling to stand up on the ground and then turned to look at the man who was surrounded by the words, "Not to be trifled with." After her shower, she had been waiting for her hair to dry. This place was full of men and there was not even a hairdryer. Even if there was one, she did not know how to use it. After all, she had never used it before. At this moment, the wind blew through her soft, black hair. Under the moonlight, the young man had a face that was difficult to distinguish between a man and a woman. Although the black uniform on her body was slightly loose, she was so handsome that many people couldn't help but point at her. She was only 13 years old, but she already had an indescribable allure and charm. "Oh my God, I didn't take a good look at him in the afternoon. The boy you brought is quite handsome. Is he sure he's a man? Why is her skin so soft and tender? Don't tell me he's a girl?" Hearing the word girl, Feng Ling looked directly at the person who spoke. Her expression remained unchanged, but the corners of her mouth curved charmingly and coldly. "Girl? You're only 13 years old and haven't even reached the age of puberty yet. Do you want to try my fist first?" Hearing that he said he was 13 years old and directly provoked him, the other party, who had been here for 3 years like Kay, didn't believe that he couldn't beat such an untrained little boy, so he readily accepted the challenge. Nan Heng didn't speak and just let them fight. However, the man had just stepped onto the training ground. In the blink of an eye, before the group of people could see Feng Ling's movements clearly, the man was already lying on the ground, and his back was stepped on by Feng Ling. However, because it was just a casual kick, Feng Ling didn't hurt him. She just made the man hurt a little, withdrew her foot, took a step back and said with clear eyes, "Do you want to continue fighting? You can't even beat a girl, okay?" The man's face turned livid with anger, but he was really convinced. After all, this boy's attack speed was so fast that it surprised him. He said a few words to resolve the embarrassment and fled in the laughter of the group of brothers. Kay secretly gave her a thumbs up from below, and then he turned his head to the brothers beside him and kept bragging about how Feng Ling saved him that day. The group of people were stunned and felt that this 13-year-old boy was almost deified, but just now, his attack speed was really amazing. Feng Ling's speed was an instinct that she had trained since she was a child in a wolf pack. This was indeed a speed that some people might not be able to achieve even if they trained for decades. This was also the key to her unexpected victory even though she hadn't received formal strict training. Nan Heng just looked at her and didn't speak. When Feng Ling looked at him, under the cold moonlight, this was the first time that Feng Ling saw the man's face clearly since that time in the sauna room. Although she had seen his face at that time, it was still a bit blurred in the water vapor, and then she covered her face with a towel. The man in front of her had pitch-black eyes that were deep and bewitching. His handsome face was slightly more robust, but it just so happened that his facial features were just right. When he looked at her, his gaze was cold, as if he could penetrate her entire body in an instant. "You do have some skills." The man looked serious and his tone was so flat that no one could hear his emotions. There was no smile on his cold face. Feng Ling glanced at him and smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "What? The legendary Boss Lee has stage fright? Are you afraid of losing face in front of your group of men?" Hearing this, Nan Heng's originally cold black eyes suddenly lit up with a frightening cold flame. The group of members around couldn't help holding their breath and didn't dare to say a word. This boy was really King courageous. The group of members who had planned to go back to take a shower and go to bed early because they still had to get up early tomorrow morning for training didn't plan to leave. They wanted to stand here and watch how he would die in the hands of Boss. Watching Boss Lee being provoked by a brat was much more interesting than watching the other brothers fall into the mud again and again during training. However, just when everyone didn't know what Boss planned to say or do, Nan Heng suddenly made a move. Feng Ling's reaction was also very fast. At the moment when he attacked, she dodged and responded with a move. However, Nan Heng's speed from attacking her lower body to changing his target was so fast that even Feng Ling didn't expect it. His eyes suddenly changed, and when she realized it, the man's hand had already attacked her upper body and directly hit her chest. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.